Hello, and welcome back to another Constitution Day with the Bill of Rights Institute. We are excited to be here with you, and I can't believe that it's September already. My name is Kirk Higgins, and I'm the Director of Content here at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And I'm Rachel Davison-Humphreys, Director of Outreach, and we're so excited that you're here with us for Constitution Day Live 2022. Before we get started, make sure you're following us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, right here on YouTube. We want to hear your questions throughout the day, but also you can subscribe for events, resources, and learn all about what the Bill of Rights Institute is doing throughout the year to support Bill of Rights, Constitution, all the things you love. We're excited to welcome you back for this Constitution Day, where we have a new theme this year, Kirk. Our new theme is the Constitution at Work, and we'll be exploring that throughout the day.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk about that because it's really doing what the Bill of Rights Institute does, thinking about principles, but also how they play out in our everyday lives. But you know, Rachel, technically tomorrow, September 17th, is Constitution Day, which of course we all know is the day that the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 sent the Constitution out to the states for ratification, which meant approval by the states to determine whether or not the Constitution would be the new law of the land, replacing the Articles of Confederation. So those delegates sat in those hot rooms in Philadelphia from May until September working on this document, and it was on September 17th that they finally were able to put names to paper and send it out to the states.
And it created a kind of mission statement for the United States, right? What is our purpose? What do we do? Well, in case you don't know, the Bill of Rights Institute has a new mission this year, 2022. Our new mission is the Bill of Rights Institute teaches civics. We equip students and teachers to live the ideals of a free and just society. And alongside that, we also crafted a new mission for our organization, which is that the Bill of Rights seeks an America where we more perfectly realize the promise of liberty and equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. This calls for civic education that helps students examine the story of our country and exercise the skills of citizenship. And that mission and vision is exactly why we do Constitution Day Live every year, as we've been doing. Is now this the fourth year, Kirk?
Yeah, it is, which is pretty incredible. And all of it has always been sort of about this idea of the Constitution at work, but in different iterations. So back in 2019, all those years ago, we looked at the idea of e pluribus unum, so out of many one. What does that mean? How are we thinking about how we come together? What are the mechanics of us coming together? We also 2 years ago talked about united we stand ? So we are united, but we have a lot of disagreement in the country, and that's normal when it comes to a democracy. But how do we navigate that? What does that really mean? And then, of course, last year we looked at the relationship between liberty and equality and how those two principles play out within our constitutional system. As with everything we do here at the Bill of Rights Institute, it's always rooted in our principles and virtues framework, which we're going to show you right now. This document, I know, is pretty exciting to look at, but the idea of this is that we're thinking about these fundamental principles, these big ideas that are laid into our governing documents in really important ways. We're thinking about natural rights and what it means to be an individual, how it is that we then work together to realize those rights through consent in Republican government, how we keep that government limited to those ends so that it doesn't become oppressive, how we can maintain that government through these constitutional auxiliary powers, and then of course the Bill of Rights is different rights that are outlined for us that we set aside that are really protected from any kind of laws or issues that may come up in government. And those things sit at the heart of our constitutional system for a reason. And today we're going to talk a little bit about them, but really what we're going to talk about is how do these play out in the day-to-day life of government?
I really love that slide, and you can find it on our website. If you just type principles or virtues onto the website, you can find this beautifully designed document that really has a nice visual effect of the building structure of our principles and these approachable definitions for really complex foundational ideas. So to help us explore these complicated ideas, we have a jam-packed day looking at the Constitution at work, people who work directly with the Constitution and constitutional ideas. Throughout today, you're going to see U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, Major Garrett, the Chief Washington correspondent for CBS, Laura Brown, president of the News Center, Jennifer Epstein, a U.S. park ranger who gave us a special tour of the Lincoln Memorial you don't want to miss with our colleague Mary Patterson, John Schaff, professor of government at Northern State University, Dan Mahoney, professor of political science at Assumption University, both of whom are interviewed by Tony Williams, BRI, the Bill of Rights Institute senior scholars, and a lovely conversation with student leaders from across the country. We also have a special U.S. history trivia contest hosted by our own Chris Jansen, which will run throughout the show, and you'll have time to win a special prize. There are many reasons to stick around, so we're going to start with Chris for the first trivia question.
Kirk and Rachel, this is really interesting. But as an old soul and a history buff, I really wanted to understand the original cast of characters involved in the founding before I can tackle all these modern day questions. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Jansen, and I am the Manager of Marketing and Communications here at the Bill of Rights Institute. As we examine the Constitution at work today through interviews with scholars, public officials, authors, and journalists, we wanted to take some time to look at just a few of the men who crafted this blueprint for governance in the summer of 1887, with a recurring segment today that I'm calling Facts About the Founders, some not so trivial trivia about the delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So to get us started, here are a few fast facts. First of all, did you know that the Constitutional Convention was made up of 55 delegates from all 13 states except Rhode Island? Did you know that the convention started when it achieved a quorum on May 25th, 1787, when delegates from 7 states had finally arrived? Not only were they all white property-owning men, 30 of the 55 were veterans of the Revolution, about half were lawyers, and 7 had served as governors of their states, and 25 of them owned slaves. So here's where you and your students come in. In each of my 5 remaining segments today, I'm going to introduce a quick fact or two about one of the 1787 delegates. And if you can name that founder, you and your students will win a Bill of Rights Institute curriculum kit, also known as the BRIC, containing posters, stickers, and other cool BRI swag. In order to win, you must be the first to email me the correct answer. I will share the answers during my next segment. Got it? Okay, here's our first trivia question. This founder was also known as the penman of the Revolution, who, among other things, was the author of the lyrics to the first American patriotic song. Be the first to email me the name of that founder at cjansen@mybri.org. That's cjansen, Janson, at mybri.org. And you will win a box of swag for your classroom. We'll see you back here in a few minutes with the correct answer.
So those are some tricky questions. Rachel, do you think you know the answer?
Oh, I'm not so sure.
Well, if you do have the answer, remember to email Chris at cjanson, that's Janson, at mybri.com. He'll be watching his email, so don't wait. Get your answers in and see if you can win the prize. But I'm really excited to look at this first segment, which we have coming up in just a second, which was filmed at the Society of Cincinnati in Washington, D.C., which is a really cool place. Rachel, have you been?
I actually have. It was a really beautiful building. It's incredibly ornate. These big sweeping marble staircases and just gorgeous details. And my favorite part, of course, is they have a really, really nice library. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to an event at the Society of Cincinnati or have opportunity to go inside, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, so it's also a great interview, and we're lucky enough to have someone with us who did that interview, who also happens to be Rachel and I's boss, and that is Stan Swim. Welcome, Stan.
I love being interviewed as a boss. Not really.
So, Stan, you've had the opportunity not only this year, but over the last few years on Constitution Day to talk with different individuals. But this year we were thinking about the Constitution at work. So what does that phrase mean to you?
Well, the Constitution, of course, is a legal document, but ultimately it comes down to real people, elected officials, you and I, as people who can vote and participate in our government. All of us make it real. So it's not some intangible thing, and it's actually an amazingly short document. If you compare that to other constitutions that exist in the world, ours is actually really efficient, and it's actually pretty accessible. If you can learn a couple of key things with the language, it really helps, and it's something we should all be able to understand and participate in.
You've had such interesting conversations. The one with Major Garrett and Dr. Brown are as an example. Throughout your career, you've had lots of these kinds of conversations, Stan. Why is it important for our constitutional system that we engage with lots of different perspectives?
Well, it's a great question, Rachel, and I think one of them goes, if you think about the nature of what we're trying to do here, we're trying to live in a free society, and that means we're going to live with a lot of difference. That's just how it works. And so what the Constitution is, if it's nothing else, is a way to govern and function as a whole system, even when we don't all disagree, and yet still find a way to move together, enjoy our freedoms, and build communities with each other.
Yeah, and so one of the places that agreement and disagreement kind of plays out is in our Constitution. And in the interview that we're about to see, you talk about you say a phrase called the structural Constitution. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. And I'll just give an example. So the Constitution is a system, I mentioned a minute ago, for helping us kind of build the communities and enjoy our freedom the way we want to. It's meant to help us get where we want to go eventually. And that eventually is a really key thing. So one of the devices that I find sometimes frustrating, but also really interesting, is multiple majorities. And the way that we do things in our country involves not just one majority, but several different kinds. And let's just take what is involved in passing a law through Congress. The people who are in the House, yes, they take a vote on the law, but before they get to do that, they had to get elected in their congressional district, which is a part of their state. Before they could do that, they had to be elected in some sort of a primary election. So there's 3 majorities just to get a bill out of the House. Then you go over to the Senate, and you have the exact same thing going on, except it's not the same majorities, because a senator is elected through a statewide process, not a district process, and only a third of them are elected every 2 years. So whereas a House member faces election every 2 years, the Senate moves slower, and it's a different majority talking when the Senate talks. Then, so that's another 3 majorities, right? Then we go to the president, and the president is elected in a national election where all the states are represented through the Electoral College. So there's that majority, but how do we get to the Electoral College majority? It's a popular majority, but not nationwide, of every state. That may seem crazy, but what it really means is that the things that get done under this system as it runs now, we want those to be the things that lots of us agree on, asked different ways and at different times. And it's meant to have a stabilizing effect even as we work toward the ends of our freedom and enjoying our time in society.
And really gets at, like that description really gets at the workings of the Constitution, our theme of this series. And so we're going to be listening to a lot of different interviews over the course of the next couple of hours. We're excited that you're here and you're going to join us. Stan, we went to the Society of the Cincinnati. If you're curious about them, there's a link to them in our bio. But you interviewed 2 major figures. What do you think the audience should really be listening for in those interviews?
Well, they are major figures. One of them is Major, right? Major Garrett. Major and Laura are both lifelong observers of the presidency and what goes on there in Washington. Laura more as a historian, Major as a reporter. It was really fascinating, but we were in a fascinating place to think about it. The Society of the Cincinnati is really born out of Washington's letting go of military power and balancing that back over to the people. So it was a cool place to have that conversation, and the conversation itself was great too.
Well, terrific. Well, without further delay, let's take a look at the interview.
Laura, Major, we're delighted to have you with us as we attempt today to spend time exploring the office of the presidency and inviting students and teachers into a conversation about that office, how it relates to the other branches of government, and how we relate to that. Because if those three are if the executive, the judicial, and the legislative are the branches, the people are the trunk. And so we want to talk about how we understand and process that and what we learn from there. Invite each of you to just start by sharing how you became interested in the presidency and how that has been a part of your career, as it has for both of you. Laura.
Sure. I mean, I will say that I began really interested in two ideas, character and leadership. And what is so interesting to me about the office of the presidency is that is really the place within our federal government that those attributes reside and have the most expression. I think one of the things that's so interesting when you think about our government is so many of the roles are to a certain extent constrained, right? They're constrained by rules and procedures. And even though the presidency has sort of large bounds, it is also true that a president has more latitude than anyone else in our system.
For me, it's kind of personal. I was born in 1962. I had two cousins who served in combat in the Vietnam War. So when I was about 7 or 8, that would be 69, 1970, I remember packing care packages with my mother to my two cousins fighting in a war in a very distant place. And that was kind of about my first understanding that there was a president and a Congress that were making decisions about this huge thing. And I felt involved somehow in that enterprise. Then let's just advance 6 years later. It's 1976. We're celebrating our bicentennial. I'm 14 years old. And there's a long running conversation about what does America mean at age 200. So in the formative years of my life, thinking about a career in journalism, these things were very vivid, very personal, and on my doorstep every day. And that thing that was on the doorstep was a newspaper. And my greatest ambition as a child was to maybe someday figure out if I could be in a newspaper as a writer, maybe someday get to Washington and observe and report for the country these very things that arrived on my doorstep as a child.
Laura, as a scholar, you've studied the office from the standpoint of a political scientist. Can you give us a portrait of the boundaries and the capabilities of that office as they may be designed and as they might be conceived of on paper? And then, Major, I'd love to hear you describe how does that really work out when it goes hot?
So I think what is so interesting is that when we think about the presidency is that it's changed so much. It really was an office that was designed by the framers to essentially restrain an individual. They were there to lead, but really to execute what it was that Congress did. In other words, their job was in some ways more administrative. It was more symbolic. It was also kind of bounded around the idea of the negative. So when we think about a veto, really what that is about is a president saying, I don't want Congress to do something.
Congress loves to say presidents propose, but Congress disposes. Congress has the ultimate power. And there are a couple of enormous powers in Congress's hands that the president can never take away or encroach upon. Power to tax, power to spend. And if the president negotiates a treaty, a power to say yes or no to that treaty. These are deeply imbued and invested powers in Congress. And I've watched that clash play out. And Laura writes beautifully about the character aspects that presidents have brought to that office. We're going to switch roles here ever so slightly. I'm going to talk about some larger contextual issues I believe we should think about historically as the presidency has evolved. So one of the times when presidential powers were really scrutinized was the Civil War. What did Lincoln do with these presidential powers? That was because of a structural challenge by the original sin of slavery, and a war fought to resolve that issue once and for all. The next great challenge, that's a structural challenge to the powers of the presidency. The next great challenge to the powers of the presidency where they were redefined was economic, Great Depression. And we had an activist president with an activist Congress that redefined constitutional interpretation of what the powers of the federal government were because of an economic crisis. Then we had a scientific change to the presidency. That's the nuclear age and the Cold War. And all of the presidential powers that grew as a result of the Cold War were about this great threat. And the president was invested with the idea that you have to watch this threat and maybe act in ways that a previous president wouldn't because the threat was so large. The last one that changed the attitude about powers of the presidency, from my perspective, is the ideological one of a global jihad, meaning terrorism around the world all the time. And after 9/11, we heard this phrase pop up every now and again: the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We are not going to adhere to all these niceties of the Constitution if there is something that is so threatening to this country and its sense of peace and tranquility that we're going to abide by these rules and not fight this terroristic enemy. I think those are the four big places in which presidencies and the country observing it have watched power shift, and more often than not in the president's direction.
But let me also, switching these roles, note that with every one of those changes came major changes within the media. I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting is that how presidents are covered really significantly changes that proximity to the public and the amount at which presidents feel they need to be in front of the issues and before the Congress.
So what if we go back to the beginning of all this, when technology, at least as we understand it, was the printing press, and that was sort of it. We're talking today in the Society of the Cincinnati, which was born out of Washington's officer corps as we got to the end of the Revolution. And Washington had a couple of precedent-setting things that he chose to do. One of them was to reinforce the separation of the military from the civilian authority. And that's in part what this institution, I think, is kind of a memorial to in so many important ways. But he was precedent-setting in a lot of others. Laura, how did he understand his boundaries, and what role did he play in setting them?
Well, certainly President Washington knew that almost everything he did would be seen as a precedent. So he was very aware of etiquette, from kind of whether he would be balancing his riding in an ornate coach versus walking in the streets with big boots to represent his sense of commonality with the people. He also really eschewed his relationship to the military when he was president, because he wanted to reinforce the idea that civilians are in charge of the military. So there was even some controversy around the Society of the Cincinnati and his desire to kind of be a part, but also be somewhat distant from it in the early days.
Washington chose to serve only 2 terms. That was a self-imposed limitation. And I think he's interesting because more than anybody else, he had a say in all of the limits that were set upon the presidency. Nobody else has had quite that say since. But where does that stand now, Major? As you look at the last couple of decades, you've been witness to so many contests and conversations about this. How does all that trace back, and how do you see it moving?
So presidents that I've covered have struggled with this question of, what are my powers? How can I best exercise them? What if Congress simply is immovable? Not resistant, but immovable. And I've covered presidents who've basically come to the presidency and say, well, look, because I'm here now, Congress won't be immovable. They might be resistant, but we'll work it out. And to some degree, they've succeeded. But in other times, they've been completely frustrated. Among my most vivid memories of that is President Obama dealing with the question of immigration. He really believed that Congress could be movable on the question of large structural reform to America's immigration system, a big update. And the negotiations went on, and he kept investing and spending money on border enforcement. Some in his party began to call him the deporter-in-chief. Some progressives who were deeply aggrieved by how much he was leaning into sort of the enforcement side of the question on immigration. And I know from talking to those very close to President Obama, that was a concerted policy maneuver to deal with a political issue, demonstrate his seriousness so resistant Republicans would come around. Former President Clinton did that in a much smaller way. I remember Paul Begala, one of his top advisors, talking about executive orders. Stroke of the pen, law of the land. How great is that? George W. Bush, again, in the era after 9/11, expanded, sometimes secretively, sometimes publicly, presidential powers. either in pursuit of the public good or because they regarded the procedure of going through Congress a dead end. And this reinterpretation of presidential powers is with us right now. Very recently, President Biden has decided that there's a way to interpret existing legislation that allows him to cancel hundreds of billions of dollars of college debt in a way that no previous president has seen. Law was there, only he sees it. This is an application, an expression, and an expansion of presidential powers.
And this is very dangerous. I'll just say that this is where we see presidents deciding that their will should be the country's will. And that is different, sort of in every way, from what our framers really understood. They really believed that Congress was Article 1 for a reason. It was the branch that was there to represent all of us in our local and state interests.
When we get to elections and especially to the results of elections, many times there's conversation that students will hear about there having been a mandate secured through this election. Major, could you respond to what is a mandate in the terms that you see it? And Laura, I'd like you to expand, if you would, on how that's looked historically, because I think that's changed pretty significantly too. What's a mandate in public terms as well as constitutional terms?
I think it's pretty vague in constitutional terms. I think it's all interpretive. I think it's one grand interpretive dance that presidents put on for the country. I'm elected and I'm going to fill in this thing that I call the mandate with all the things I want to put in it because I won. I've earned the right to fill this vessel, which I will call the mandate and hold in front of you and call the mandate, with all the things I want it to mean. And as long as I'm close enough to your acceptance of what I've said to you I'm putting in the mandate, we're good. If I exceed your expectations or your will to follow, then I may lose your favor and fall out of favor. But mandates are for presidents to decide, and they shift.
You know, as Major suggested, mandates are invented. They are claimed by presidents as a justification to help them move forward on issues or ideas that they feel are central to their presidency. And usually those are expressed in their campaign platforms. So they come into office with sort of all of this head of steam about what they are and what that means. Certainly, Abraham Lincoln had in 1863 issued the Emancipation Proclamation and knew that he was now redefining, if you will, his campaign mandate as not just being about the Union, but being about abolishing slavery in its forms all across the Union. And I think this is where he, anticipated that he would actually not win re-election. And when he did, then I think there was a mandate which moved forward into the constitutional amendments that abolished slavery and provided for African Americans to, or I should say, African American men to be able to vote.
We've talked a lot about constitutional and structural limits that are there. How many, what kind of limits does the person bring with them themselves? Laura, you've written about this a lot. Let's talk about what you see there and how do you analyze that?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's so interesting, right? Because as I just sort of went into, presidents do push and pull the system in the ways that they want. But it is also the case that all of our presidents, up until former President Donald Trump, had had a tremendous amount of experience in politics or the military, or they had a deep grounding, whether it was a law degree or an education within the parties, about how democratic politics work and how our institutions of American government are supposed to proceed. And I think one of the things that you see that was so incredibly important as you look at this is that past presidents kind of knew where the opportunities existed for them to push into the system without breaking the system. What has been the reaction around President Trump by many of my colleagues has been he didn't understand those guardrails, those norms, those kind of unwritten rules of separation of powers and democracy. And he only cared about his policy ideas or his political wishes. And so in many ways, I think most of my colleagues would say he attempted to break the system, not just transform it or push it in a way that other presidents of other times have.
With the mandate that he thought he had, right?
Yes.
Welcome back, friends. Well, did you figure out who the penman of the revolution was? It was none other than John Dickinson. A prolific writer and a cautious conservative when it came to the issue of independence from Great Britain, Dickinson was from Delaware, and he also was the drafter of the Articles of Confederation. Are you ready for your next challenge? Okay, here we go. This framer was one of the youngest delegates to the convention and is credited with being the first to use the word Senate. He also worked to prohibit religious qualifications for public office. Who was this founder? Can you name him? Be the first to email me the correct answer at cjanson, that's cjanson, Janson, at mybri.org, and win a box of swag for your students. And we'll see you right back here in just a few minutes.
So did you guess John Dickinson? Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and of course subscribe here for events, for ways to stay involved with U.S. history, and also to respond to Chris so you can try and win one of those prizes. We have a live chat going on right now too if you're watching on YouTube, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on how the live stream is going. If you have any questions for Rachel and I, post them in there. We'll try to answer them as best we can, and don't be shy about leaving a comment.
And we already saw some friendly faces. Karen Washington from Massachusetts, one of our teacher council members, is in the chat. Kristen Hillman from Utah, one of our curriculum instructors, is also in the chat. So hi, ladies, and hello to all of our friends who are already leaving comments and letting us know how the stream is going. If you're just joining, we just watched part of an interview with Dr. Laura Brown and Major Garrett of CBS News. If you'd like to watch the video again or check out any of the resources to dive deeper, they can be found on our website. And many of them are linked in the chat below each video. Kirk, what struck you most about this particular clip?
Yeah, you know, the one word that really stood out to me was mandate, which is a weird word. We don't usually use it in our day-to-day lives. But it's something that we hear quite often in politics. Laura and Major both had a very particular way that they were thinking about mandates, especially when it came to presidents. And what they were talking about was like the mandate is kind of claimed by the president. It's something they campaign on different issues. You may hear different presidents talking about, I am going to do X, Y, or Z when I get into office. And that mandate they claim is that, well, if I campaigned on that, then people probably agree with me. And so I'm going to do those things. They've said that I should do those things.
But there's complexity there, and that's what Stan was getting into in our previous comment about the layers of majority and then the tyranny of the majority and all of those kind of complexities, because when the Constitution is at work, it really reflects a kind of will that people have. So what's the role of the president in that job of interpretation becomes a really important question to answer. Because so much of what the elected officials do is take the constitutions, both the national and the state constitutions, and evaluate how they're supposed to act, how we should act on whatever the modern context is we are, right? These documents were written hundreds of years ago. The amendments keep them relevant, but every generation reinterprets and has to do the work of constitutional principles and interpretation. And yeah, no, that started at the beginning, right? Because Washington was a great example of this, right, Kirk?
Yeah, Washington certainly had a lot that he needed to interpret and figure out and work on behalf of the people. So he saw himself, as Laura kind of mentioned, an executive in a way that is guiding the answers, guiding the country towards what Congress is passing laws to do. But he had kind of an implicit mandate in that he was elected to this responsibility, that he needed to preserve Republican government. And so he did so by being very conscious about when he would get involved in politics directly, when he would speak on things. Even to the point of him leaving office after his second term was all trying to promote this idea of what good Republican looked like. And in his case, he thought it wasn't serving until the end of his life, but it was serving until he felt that he could step away and then giving up that power, which was an incredible thing to do at the time, giving up that power to someone else.
And that goes to just this idea that the office has to evolve, right? And Washington was very clear that it would have to evolve past him, right? So this is something we'll definitely come back to later today in our sessions about the evolving nature of the presidency.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a couple years ago, we had a conversation with Dr. Nicholas Cole, who talked about our constitutional structure in this structural constitution that Stan was mentioning earlier is built in a way that allows for these changes and these different interpretations to play themselves out, especially public policy debates. There's not policy prescriptions, meaning policy outcomes and answers aren't in the Constitution. What's in there is a framework for us to have conversations and dialogue and debates.
And that framework is what helps presidents put things in motion, right? So how do we take all these very, sophisticated principles, like working to advance liberty and equality, and make them real? How do we make the Constitution work? That's our question today. We have to look at people, how they work with legislators, the executive chief comes into the conversation, and then help get action and actually do the execution on the things that they promised.
Yeah, and that's really hard. And to help us think through how that works or how executives think about it, our senior teaching fellow, Tony Williams, sat down with two scholars, Dan Mahoney and John Schaff, to explore this idea in something they call statesmanship. Let's check it out.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow for BRI, and we want to welcome you to our celebration of Constitution Day. We're honored to be joined by Dan Mahoney, who is the author of The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation, and also by scholar John Schaff, who is the author of Abraham Lincoln Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. As we think about the important themes of rights, law, and liberty for Constitution Day. Now, the guiding question for today's discussion is, how did Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship of principle and prudence guide the nation through the Civil War towards a vision of principled self-government and the common good for all Americans? I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. Very happy to be here.
Thanks for having me, Tony. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks. Dan, we'll start with you. You wrote a book, The Statesman as Thinker. And so what is statesmanship, and what is the role of a statesman in a republic or democracy?
I'm tempted to paraphrase Potter Stewart's famous remark about obscenity, that he knows it when he sees it, but I don't think that will do. One point in the book, I have epigraphs from some of the chapters of the book, and I have a quotation from Stephen Smith, a political theorist at Yale, who says, both Millard Fillmore and Abraham Lincoln were politicians, but that doesn't tell us very much. But Lincoln was a statesman and Millard Fillmore was not, and that tells us a lot more. So that's a good starting point, I think, that the statesmanship involves a level of thoughtfulness, public spiritedness, the exercise of the classical or cardinal virtues, particularly prudence. Today, prudence often is understood to mean timidity or calculation, or what Edmund Burke once called a false reptile prudence, where, wouldn't be prudent to do anything that involved patriotism or exertion. Now, when I use the word prudence, I have in mind what the Greeks called phronesis, practical reason, practical wisdom, which is at once an intellectual and moral virtue. I don't think statesmen, as Charles de Gaulle once said, have to be informed or should be informed by evangelical perfection. But I do think statesmanship involves certain intellectual and moral virtues that involve, for one thing, combining honorable ambition with love of country and public spiritedness. So I think almost by definition, the statesman is not a tyrant. The tyrant is all about self-aggrandizement. Of course, the statesman and the tyrant have in common ambition, but as the political scientist Robert Faulkner has argued, there is a huge difference between a kind of undirected ambition. Lincoln dealt with it in his Lyceum address. The members of the tribe of the lion and eagle who would do anything. They don't want to follow a beaten path. They'll free the slaves or enslave in order to satisfy their ambition. But that is not honorable ambition. So the idea of a kind of greatness of soul informed by the cardinal virtue of prudence, combined with a kind of public spiritedness that's not soft and not, you might say, excessively idealistic, but takes very seriously the exigencies of the civic common good. And, my book, I really emphasize that in many cases, the highest forms of statesmanship are accompanied by very high levels of thoughtfulness. Lincoln is certainly a wonderful example of that. He didn't write any books, but he's the philosopher poet of the American political order, whether it's the Lyceum address of 1838 or his second inaugural and everything in between. There's a deep level of reflection, I would say, not only about constitutionalism, not only about the moral foundations of free government, not only about the evils of slavery, but also in a way about himself. What does it mean to be a statesman at the service of a free society? So the Lyceum address, or an 1864 address in Baltimore, where he reflects on, how hard it is to differentiate the shepherd from the wolf, But he was thinking, he knew that the kind of leadership that was necessary to sustain a free political order is not, he may have talked about government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and he meant it, but he also knew that, in a free political order needed somebody like himself to sustain popular self-government. So that combination, I think, of prudence, public spiritedness, of honorable ambition, and thoughtfulness, I would say those are, they reflect a tough-minded moderation. And I can't think of a better description for what animated Lincoln. The real heroes were not the abolitionists who would have blown up the Union out of pure principle. The real hero was a statesman such as Lincoln, who knew that a free political order, that the arts of prudence were necessary both to sustain the American Republic and put slavery on the road to eventual extinction.
Excellent. Thank you. So over to you, John. BRI has a lot of curricula that address the civic virtue, and I know you've written about it extensively in your books. So what were the habits of civic virtue that the statesman Lincoln cultivates among Americans for that spirit of a common good and common purpose?
It might be helpful to start by thinking just a little bit about what is virtue. Virtue, of course, means excellence, and it is a product of habit and of action. So a passive people can not be called virtuous. That's not civic virtue if a people is passive. So what are the excellences that Lincoln would like the American people to practice? And I think there's four of them. I hope I can get through these apace. Number one is rule of law, and I think this is going to come up, I think, probably more than once. But Lincoln wants the people to develop a deep respect for the law. I know the definition of tyranny is when the government acts arbitrarily without limit. You know, one of the virtues of Dan's recent book is its discussion of Cicero, informed eventually by a bit of Christianity, the way it adds a sense of humility and restraint to Aristotle's discussion of magnanimity, this idea of limit. So the rule of law directs the public will and keeps it from being arbitrary. So that's one, rule of law. Two would be moderation. And I mean this in two senses. One is moderation is a balance of goods. There are always competing goods in politics. When we talk about democratic politics, we usually think of things like the good of consent, the good of natural rights, the good of equality, these sorts of things. And you have to give each of these things its proper due. And part of that requires the prudence that Dan just talked about, and the avoidance of ideological politics, which is emphasizing one good thing at the expense of all the other good things. Again, Dan talks about this, I think, mostly when he's talking about Edmund Burke in his recent book, that ideological politics in its quest for purity ends in terror. So this balance of competing goods is a great civic virtue, but also another way of moderation is recognizing the legitimate claims of your opponents. You know, the quote I always use from Lincoln from his Washington Temperance Address is that if you would persuade a man, you must first convince him that you are his friend. You have to give some indication that you understand and respect the other person's point of view. I think you can look at the what is my favorite Lincoln speech, which is the speech at Peoria in 1854 on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, when over and over in that speech, he gives credit to the Southern opinion and wants to chasten or humble the self-righteousness of Northern opinion, the anti-slavery opinion. We know what side Lincoln's on. He's not siding with the South, but he wants to say, here are their legitimate claims, and I want to forthrightly recognize those, even though I'm now going to say why they're ultimately wrong, right? So rule of law, moderation. I do want to say something about free labor, about an ownership society. Lincoln's economics are driven by a desire for independence rather than wealth creation, though he has no problem with wealth creation. An economy that promotes free labor, right? And the habits of liberty, the habits of a citizen are developed with economic liberty, he thinks, when he says in his Wisconsin agricultural speech that we will be free of crown kings, land kings, and money kings. If each man owns his own labor, what we might call a kind of proprietorship or entrepreneurship is important to create civic virtue. Then last thing, you can't talk about Lincoln without talking about natural rights. I'll talk about probably this more a little bit later, but we all have to recognize there are things that we want that aren't good for us. And if that's true of us as individuals, it's true of us as a people. And there's the justice of the people's decisions are not just reflected that it's an act of public will, but that they conform with some concept of natural justice, which for Lincoln is natural right, as articulated in the Declaration of Independence. So those virtues, again, are rule of law, moderation, a kind of economic liberty, and natural rights. I think these are the things he wants to cultivate.
Excellent. Back over to you, Dan. Lincoln spoke of an apple of gold and a picture of silver, and it's very poetic and eloquent biblical metaphor to describe the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So what were the ennobling and timeless principles of the natural law, of constitutionalism, of law and liberty in Lincoln's words and statesmanship?
Yeah, I think just to relate my remarks to what John had just said, I think it's very clear that Lincoln did not advocate a kind of positivistic constitutionalism, that our principles are simply inherent in the constitutional framework. I think he is not simply a person who affirms the creedal foundations of American liberty. I think you can have a one-sided reading of Lincoln that, in a way, exaggerates the the centrality of the Declaration of Independence and ignores all the other pillars John talked about, including a certain understanding of political economy, a certain understanding of the rule of law, a certain understanding of self-restraint. But it is the case that Lincoln saw that the Declaration of Independence, broadly understood, provided the soul, you might say, the animating principles, the animating spirit of America's constitutional arrangements. And of course, that image of the apple of gold in the frame of silver comes from Proverbs. So, as so much of Lincoln's rhetoric, it's a kind of biblical republicanism. But I do think there's a reason why certain paleocon conservatives have been so skeptical of Lincoln. I mean, you read some of them going way back, and Lincoln is called a Gnostic and someone with messianic politics, an advocate of the very ideological politics he repudiated. And I think that has to do with this misplaced judgment that an appeal to universal principles is necessarily at odds with a politics of prudence or with the framework of rule of law that instantiates and gives form to those principles, the principles of the Declaration among them. And I also would say that Lincoln, there's lots of debates about what the Declaration is. You can read it in a kind of strictly Lockean way, but it is important, I think, that Lincoln placed great emphasis on its religious dimension. And that meant liberty under God. Tocqueville has a beautiful expression, liberty under God and the laws. I think Lincoln in his own way affirms that at Gettysburg and elsewhere, that it's, the Declaration is not only a declaration of independence, it's not only an affirmation of enduring truths, it's not only right-centered, but it also gives rise to high claims about duty and honor and self-respect.
Hello, and welcome to our celebration of Constitution Day with the Bill of Rights Institute. We're excited to have you here, and we're so glad you can join us because we're doing a trivia contest this year, which is really exciting. Remember, if you have answers to our trivia questions that will be happening throughout the day, email Chris Jansen, that's C. Jansen, Janson, at mybri.org, and you could have a chance to win a box set of resources from one of our newest curricular resources, the Plainest Demands of Justice. And we just had a question in from the audience asking us what our favorite primary source document is to read on Constitution Day, and it just so happens that the Plainest Demands of Justice is all about primary sources. So, Rachel, what's your favorite primary source to read on Constitution Day?
This question came in from Liz, our good friend. She works at the Arizona State University School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. She asked, what documents other than the Constitution should we read on Constitution Day? And whenever I'm asked this question, I always answer the same way, and that is Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It's actually the perfect document to read on any civic holiday, even Valentine's Day, which is Frederick Douglass's chosen birthday. So that's my answer to that question.
It is. It's a fantastic document, and I think mine would be the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'm going to speak more about in just a few minutes. But before that, we just heard this great clip from Dan Mahoney and John Schaff, and we're talking today about the Constitution at work. And what they were talking about in thinking about statesmanship is just that, the Constitution at work. How does it work? What does it mean for it to be at work? It's a document after all, so what are we really talking about? And what we're actually talking about is how do we take what people vote on when they elect elected officials and put it in motion to actually accomplish things in a representative government.
So what we're really talking about is human interaction, right? It's not, the Constitution works not just because of the rules that it sets in place, but because we all live by these rules and we make that choice every day in our daily lives. But it's not just these formal institutions like laws and courts and legislation, but it's informal institutions too. And I think on Constitution Day, when we're talking about the Constitution at work, it's important to also think about those informal places where the Constitution works for us and with us. So one of the things that when we were thinking about this question and Kirk and I were preparing, we wanted to talk a little bit about the informal institutions. What are the ways in your life that you make the Constitution work? What are the relationships you have or the things you do that are a result of the constitutional framework our culture is built on, our communities are built on? And I was actually thinking of a really simple example from my own childhood. I don't know if you had this, but I grew up in New England, or technically the Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey. It's a weird place. But when I was growing up, we used to say this thing. Whenever someone would come up to you and tell you to do something that was a young person and you didn't want to do it, you go, I'm not going to do that. It's a free country. And I love that, reflecting on it now as an adult who works in civic education, that this is a way in which the Constitution is a part of the daily fabric of our lives. That we have people, we're talking about how to think about the tyranny of the majority and all these abstract concepts, but really, it's about how it affects our daily lives. It's complicated and we don't want to be a mob, right, Kirk? So how do we do the right things? How do we think about what the right thing to do is? It's really hard. So luckily, we have some scholars who can help us along in that process. Both of the scholars talked about the Declaration of Independence as the animating spirit for understanding the Constitution. What they're talking about here is the connection between theory and practice, but it's the work of the individuals that makes it real.
Yeah, and so they use that word statesmanship and they threw out other words like prudence. So it's how does an executive think carefully about how to move towards the best good thing that they can work towards. So Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which I mentioned before, is one of those examples. Lincoln, in the fall of 1862, had an opportunity to end slavery in a way that he saw as commander-in-chief. He had spoken earlier about how it was not allowed in the constitutional framework in the way that it was laid out, but he saw an opportunity as commander-in-chief to take that action, and so he did. And so he wrote this document. It's not a very beautiful or flowery document, even though he's talked about in these flowery terms. It's a very matter-of-fact document, and that reflects what it did, and that was emancipate the slaves in the states that were in rebellion at that time in 1862. It went into effect in 1863, and that had a profound effect on the course of the war and what it was being fought over. Dan Mahoney and John Schaff are going to come back and talk more about that document in just a few minutes. But right now we're talking about another part of our government that has to have these conversations, these dialogues all the time, and that is the Congress of the United States. And so, Rachel, what can Senator Sasse tell us today about Congress?
You know, you talked about Lincoln, and Lincoln is such an incredible example of a true statesman. And that's why I'm so excited that we got Senator Sasse to speak to us, because I think regardless of what you think of his political viewpoints, he is a modern statesman. He was really studied what it means to be a statesman and work towards agreement in community. Did you know he has a classics degree? He went to Oxford. He's the youngest university in the president at one time. He was only 37 years old. So in this clip, he helps us understand how our government lives up to its ideal of the founders and how we can achieve a healthy balance of civic obligation and personal achievements.
But before we get to Senator Sasse, we're going to go back to Chris for another trivia question.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 3 of our Facts About the Founders Trivia Challenge. Did you get this one? The answer is Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, who, at 29 years old, was one of the youngest delegates at the convention. Pinckney was an advocate of elitist government who proposed high property qualifications for federal office. Pinckney was also a staunch defender of the institution of slavery, and he enslaved approximately 250 men, women, and children himself. So as such, he opposed efforts by some of the delegates to outlaw the international slave trade. Okay, ready for the next question? This founder was the son of a farmer who worked as a shoemaker before turning to a legal career. He was also one of only 2 people to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution, the other being Robert Morris from Pennsylvania. So if you know who this founder is, email me at cjansen@mybri.org. Again, that's cjansen@mybri.org, and you will win a box of swag for your classroom. And we'll see you back here in a few minutes with the correct answer.
We're pleased to welcome Senator Sasse as part of our Constitution Day Live program today. The senator is not just the senator from Nebraska, but also a longtime student and teacher of the Constitution, and we're delighted to explore with him his observations and thoughts on the relationship between the branches of government as it's set up in the Constitution. Senator, could we just start with your description of what is the unique job of your branch?
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be with you and your students. Well, obviously, we are the legislative body, the Article 1 body. So what we're supposed to do is write the laws. Article 1 and Article 3 have different purposes, but Articles 1 and 2, so Article 1, the legislature, and Article 2, the executive branch, are supposed to be able to be hired and fired by the American people on a regular basis. So in a democratic republic, we're supposed to be the legislative body that between the Senate and the House together construct whatever the legal framework is for the United States. And the Senate is supposed to be the most deliberative body. The House is obviously the popular body, hired or fired by the people every 24 months. Senators are supposed to serve 6 years, which means every time there's an election, only 1/3 of senators are turning over. So we're a continuing body in that every November when there's an election, and January when new people are, November of an odd number, even numbered year, and January of an odd numbered year, when folks are sworn in, 2/3 of us still show back up that next January and continue the conversation. So we're supposed to be doing the legislating. We're supposed to do oversight of the executive branch to make sure that it is carrying out the laws that have been passed by the Congress. And then we're supposed to also ratify treaties and confirm folks who work for the president in Article 2.
That's a lot. What does that look like in just a regular day's calendar for you and your staff? How does that go?
Well, so first of all, we spend, 80% of our work weeks in Washington, D.C. and 20% of the work weeks back home. I live in Nebraska, so I commute almost every week. So I'm home on weekends for Husker football and youth sports and driving Uber and driving a garbage truck and detasseling corn and doing ag manufacturing and listening to my constituents. But in the 80% of the weekdays that we're in D.C., when the Senate meets, the traditional structure is committees meet in the morning and the full body of the Senate meets in the afternoon. So I sit on the Intelligence, Judiciary, Finance, and Budget committees. And those committees, unfortunately, are less and less deliberative over time because I think we've made a bad mistake of putting cameras in every room around here. So what the public tends to see is a whole bunch of senators at these televised hearings acting like political weirdos and trying to grandstand for a great 10-second soundbite that they hope will go viral. And so that's really not what the committee structure is supposed to be doing. The committees are supposed to be a place where you can develop some expertise. I happen to sit on 4 pretty good committees. The average senator sits on 3 committees, and that allows you with 15 to 20 of your colleagues to develop a little bit of expertise. I'm coming to you right now having just been at a meeting with the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That's because sitting on the Judiciary Committee, I have some oversight responsibilities for the Department of Justice, and one of the sub-agencies under Justice is how do we run all the federal prisons? And one of the most important questions that the Bureau of Prisons has is how do we make sure when people are in a federal institution, prisoners tend to be there for on average 10 or 11 years, that they can redeem some of that time, and when they get released, that they don't immediately recidivate and reoffend and get re-convicted, re-incarcerated. And so the question is, do our work programs inside these federal institutions work? One of my jobs is to think about what the legislative framework is for that, but do that by oversight with the people who are the senior managers of the correctional institutions. That doesn't tend to lend itself very well to sound bites. And so the committees are supposed to be deliberative. My Intelligence Committee work tends to work pretty well, but that's because we're overseeing the NSA and the CIA, and all the work that we do is classified. And so we do it in a bunker, we do it in a SCIF, a compartmentalized facility where cameras would be illegal. You can't even have your cell phone or a smartwatch in there. And that committee tends to work pretty well because there aren't cameras. But by and large, right now, the Congress isn't too productive because you've got a lot of people who'd rather be social media stars than servant leaders trying to do the long-term grinding work of getting smart about topics that the American people sent you to do here on a 6 or 12-year basis on their behalf.
Hey, you've just alluded to a couple of these things, changes that have occurred in the cases you've mentioned very recently because of introduction of technology into the Senate. What other ways has the role and responsibility and kind of practical work of the Senate evolved since the founding and its original conception?
Yeah, I think there have been two major changes over the course of the last century. One of them I've alluded to, which is more immediacy in the media. So a shift from print journalism to radio and to the rise of TV and now viral videos on the internet makes this sense of, in a nation of 330 million people, the immediacy of if somebody sees an image of a put down or a quip real quickly, they think that government should move very, very fast. And government that moves fast tends to either screw a lot of things up or not actually get anything done because it ends up in tribal gridlock. It would be more healthy for the American people to consume more of what used to be print journalism and less of image-centric stuff. And then for the Congress to move more slowly, but move on a smaller set of more important issues. So that the first thing is our media diet is not very healthy, and that changed a lot over the course of the last century. The second biggest thing that's happened is after the New Deal, after the Great Depression, we ended up with a much, much larger federal government. And what that did was it gave a lot of executive power to the president, and Congress has gotten weaker over the last century because the presidency has gotten so strong, and politicians have an incentive to pass the buck to the executive branch, which has an army of bureaucrats writing regulations. And both parties really love to do this. So I think the thing that from a constitutional standpoint has devolved over the course of the last 240 years, for your students thinking here, not chiefly about my media consumption questions, but a little bit more about the relationship among the three branches, is the single biggest change is that Article 1, which is supposed to really write the laws, and you can't write a law to speak to every circumstance. So you have to think, what are the big and important things that should exist at the federal government? And how do you allow the rest of governance to happen at the state and local level? What's happened is the Congress has started to pass much more generic laws that aren't really completed. And then they punt to the executive branch to write regulations that essentially finish the statute. I think the single biggest change is we're supposed to have a system where we distinguish between legislation, which is deliberative, and administration or the executive branch, which is supposed to carry out the laws. And increasingly in our tradition now, we give the president a lot more power to write a huge bit of what counts as our legal framework for the country. And I think that results in a lot less healthy laws, a lot less thought out legislation, and frankly, way too much tribalism and doomsday panic around every presidential election. You have people constantly saying, this is the last election in American history, or this is the be all and end all. The whole country's going off a cliff if the bad guy of the other party wins a presidential election. Our founders would be totally confused by that kind of speech because they didn't think that the president's job was kingly. Even the term, I said I'd pull up, but I'll say one more thing here. Even the term president is a pretty weird term. I mean, the term existed before the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, but it was basically not used anywhere. The word president, as our founders employed it, was just a way to create a noun around the term presiding officer. They wanted somebody that had a ministerial servant-like role in the executive branch to carry out the laws. And they worked really hard not to give kingly powers to a president. And so they made up this term president, which was supposed to mean like secretary of the federal government, the presiding officer, the person who makes sure that the laws that the Congress passed get carried out. And right now we treat our presidents a lot more like they're, priests or kings. They're these giant figures. And our founders, and George Washington in particular, would have been very confused by that because he wanted to make sure there wasn't any regal sense that a president is all that important.
You've spent some nice time here kind of describing the relationship between the executive and legislative branches of the government. In the Senate and in committees that you serve on, you also have a very specific relationship to the judiciary. Can you describe how that relationship works and what may be the strengths and weaknesses of it as it's currently functioning?
Yeah. So obviously our judiciary is incredibly important. We talk about the separate but equal branches that are supposed to check and balance one another, but kind of like the executive branch, Article 2 has gotten stronger as Article 1, the Congress, has gotten weaker. The judiciary has also gotten more powerful over the course of the last 50, 60, 70 years. And our founders, I think, would be confused by that as well. And in particular, they would be confused by how much protest you see outside the Supreme Court. And that flows from a tradition of, you could name lots of starting points, but between the 1930s and 1970s, I think everybody would agree, the judiciary started to assert a lot more powers that are quasi-legislative powers. And that's really not what the judge's job is. And I think one of the best ways to think about that as, if you were explaining it to an 8th grader or a 10th grader or a 12th grader, is our judiciary historically has worn robes precisely as symbolism of the fact that they were cloaking their personal preferences. We don't have Republican judges or Democratic judges. Our judges don't stand for re-election, and they're not supposed to signal what their policy preferences are. Some judge might have strong personal views about, minimum wage should be much higher than it is. Minimum wage should be a little higher than it is. Minimum wage leads to the destruction and erosion of jobs and accelerates automation. You could have a lot of different policy views as an individual, but when they're a judge, none of that is supposed to matter, because what they're supposed to do is make sure that individual laws don't violate the constitutional protections that are allowed to the American people or recognized for the American people as existing in nature. We believe we have a lot of pre-governmental rights. When we say people have the right to freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, protest, we don't think the government gives us these rights. These are rights people have because they're created in the image of God. And in nature, these rights exist for people. And the government and the constitutional framework is our shared project to secure those rights. Judges are supposed to protect the individual rights of people, not being usurped by laws that are overreaching. And they're supposed to make sure that, in particular, from the district court level to the circuit or the appeals court level, that everybody gets a hearing and then gets a right of appeal about whether or not the facts have rightly been determined in a case, and that the law is being rightly applied to the circumstances and facts at play in an individual issue or matter. And so when there is so much protest around the judiciary, it's probably a sign that the judiciary is acting a lot more like a legislature. And one of the reasons why that's dangerous is because we don't give our judges those kinds of powers. And in return, they get lifetime tenure because they're not supposed to have to be accountable to the people because they weren't doing anything like representing the public will. And so if judges are going to act like legislators, then it would be pretty important in a democratic system for them to be fireable by the people if the people have different views than the way the judges are choosing to legislate. So I think it's fair to say Article 2, the executive branch, has grown in power a lot. Article 3, the judiciary, has grown in power quite a bit. And both of these flow from a dysfunction in the Congress of people wanting to be lifetime politicians and therefore not wanting to make a lot of the hard choices that might get them fired. And so you have a lot of people that are in my institution who don't want to do hard things. They don't want to be fireable. They don't want to ever really leave Washington, D.C. And so they punt powers to both the executive and judicial branches. And that's a deformity of our constitutional system.
Senator Sasse is so good at explaining those principles and how they affect his daily life as a senator. Now, elected office isn't exactly for me, but what I love about hearing people who live to such principles is how can I engage with them in my own life? How can I use my work to engage with principles. And if you're wondering how you can too, and you want to learn more about the constitutional principles that are the foundation of our society, you can go to our website, engage with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we would love to hear from you on Facebook, Twitter, and of course subscribe to our events.
Yeah, and I think it's always fascinating to hear from somebody who is working day to day in the government. Oftentimes we think of the government as sort of an abstract, impersonal thing, but they're just people that are working on behalf of their elected constituents and trying to get stuff done.
So one idea we don't talk about enough is how much modern government, or government is involved in modern American society. It's important to remember that it's not only the national, but local governments still play an important role, and there's a large responsibility and a real need for leadership in all of these spaces. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the scholars and talk, going back to scholar and president of the new center, Dr. Laura Brown, and CBF Chief Washington Correspondent, Major Garrett, as they discuss the idea of leadership in the context of the president.
Major, how do you assess what might be coming in year 3 for President Biden? And now we're talking structurally. What's he going to have to maneuver? What's likely to affect and shape it? And then Laura, if you could draw that line further back into the past, I think that'd be a really interesting study in contrast and comparison.
So the first thing to say is Laura has brought a very original thought to considering a presidency. Much of what I've read about presidencies focuses on the first year for all sorts of understandable reasons. We have this sort of once-in-a-lifetime benchmark of the Great Depression and the striking policy and political contrast between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover and the first 100 days, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of that legislation had already been written and drafted, so it was very easy to move as quickly as was moved. And that 100 days has given us a false sense of expectation about it. What's that first 100? Boy, the 100 days are everything. No, actually, they're not. And Laura has suggested, and I think wisely so, that the third year of a presidency is as instructive, if not more instructive, about what political realities are, what's been learned in the presidency, what has been the reaction to their declaration of their mandate, how it's been received in Congress, how it's been received in the public at large. What was the midterm reaction? And do you have to recalibrate a presidency after a midterm?
So let's go from the hypothetical to what's actually happened and where we can start to measure the consequences and effects, Laura. Help us understand why did you even go to year 3? What caused you to look there?
So I went to year 3 mostly because when you look back on presidential history, the third year seems to be incredibly important in terms of whether or not that president ends up winning re-election or not. In other words, it is that third year where presidents are coming off the midterm. They've essentially learned how to do the presidency. And now their big question is, what issues do I want to lay before the country? What successes do I want to tout? What unfinished business do I want to focus on? And how do I want to lay the foundation for what will be a 4th year sprint through an election? So I think what is so interesting when you really dig into it is that there's a recalibrating. There's a moment where presidents are saying, has what I've done thus far been right and good, and should I stay the course? Or do I need to make some additional tax or include something that I didn't? And those strategic decisions in the third year, I really do believe are not just what then kind of determines whether or not a president is reelected, but they become the foundational ideas of their legacy. Because should they win re-election, they then spend their next 4 years putting into place all of those ideas that were developed in the third.
So Laura, your work has gone further by saying not only is that third year important, but there are elements of a president's character that predict how they're going to handle a lot of this. And you've identified 3. Can you describe those elements and how they relate to the president's role in the constitutional structure, why those are important in your assessment?
Yeah, so I really think of leadership as being not just about you sort of being yourself, but leadership is about you recognizing what those people who are trusting in you need at any one moment. And so I really believe that good leaders, to a certain extent, are also good actors. Ronald Reagan himself said, I don't know how you could do this job if you weren't an actor. And certainly George Washington.
And he didn't mean it as an insult.
No,
either.
he didn't. And certainly George Washington saw his job in some way as about acting the part. And this is where, I make a distinction in my book about actors versus celebrities. Celebrities are about, promoting themselves, all of who they are, not bowing to anybody, and really just riding off the fame that they enjoy. Whereas actors are about trying to understand a role. They want to inhabit a character that has a sense of kind of emotional center and is imbued with expectations from the audience. And I think one of the things about our best presidents is they understand that. So they lead in, I would argue, three different ways. One way is what I call courage, another way is compassion, and another way is curiosity. I tend to think of these as the Wizard of Oz traits. If you have all three, you will eventually get to the great and all-powerful Oz. But really what you need is at times to take strong action, and that is seen as being courageous. There are times where you just need to offer sympathy or empathy to those who are suffering, and that is an expression of compassion. And then there are times when you need to sort of pause. You need to take a step back and slow down kind of the public. And that is really about leading from curiosity, where you as a president say things like, I think we need to form a commission. I think we need to have some experts look into this. So there are these different tempos, if you will, that a good leader picks up from the people and really looks to reflect that back to the people. I've often said, and Major's heard me say this, that I tend to believe that presidential rhetoric is like the background music for the country. It is not something that the public necessarily hears, but it is something that somehow kind of subconsciously moves them. And so it's very important to set the right tone at the right time.
In a moment of near maximum peril for the country, the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy can't go to Congress, really, and remedy this situation. He can maybe have a couple of conversations with some very trusted members of Congress, but he can't, in 13 days, get a solution from 535, as the saying goes, Secretaries of State. He also doesn't know exactly what the motives are at the Pentagon or the CIA, because he has lived through a calamitous political and strategic failure early in his presidency, the Bay of Pigs. So he is singularly in the office of the presidency, facing the greatest nuclear challenge of any president. He can't go to Congress, and he's unsure of the executive elements of his own government. Not distrustful, but unsure. And in that precious 13 days, and the books and the movie 13 Days is a wonderful rendering of this, he has to combine lots of instincts, character traits, curiosity, courage, conviction. And he's got to find a way out of this, to pull things back, to interpret the motives of the Soviets. And all of those decisions are in one place and one place only. And I dare say, sitting in this room, if the framers could have imagined a proposition like that, it would have terrified them at every level. And they would have said, the system we're constructing does ask a lot of this occupant. And in that crucial moment, the country had the right occupant.
The presidency is an enormous office, as we just described, bigger than any one person can ever really wrap their arms around. You can't understand everything. You end up having to think about stuff you never thought you'd have to think about in your life. But at the end, it's still one person inhabiting that. What's that like for them?
So I don't know what it's like because I've never been president. I've never aspired to that office, but I've been somewhat close enough to it to get a sense in particularly difficult moments. The most difficult moment of my life covering the American president was 9/11. I was in Sarasota, Florida with George W. Bush. I wasn't in the classroom that people see in that memorable video. I was in the adjacent classroom. A very select group of pool reporters were in the classroom. I was in the classroom next door. But as I've often told people, everyone who was close to the president that day was available to me in that adjacent room. And of course, I was not the only reporter hounding them for any information they had about what this was, what we were going to do, how bad was it going to be. Those were like the three biggies. All of them in that moment, unanswerable. So I like to explain it this way. Every day, the American president sits atop a pyramid of information. A vast pyramid of information that only the president has access to, accumulated by the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, NSA, and lots of other appendages of our government, funneling information to this vast pyramid upon which the president sits. And that information is dissected and prepared for the president and thought about and distilled, and decisions are made. In that moment of 9/11, that pyramid went like this. And our president, and I believe any president, meaning if it had been Al Gore, George W. Bush, or Ralph Nader, would have been on that same flattened pyramid. And with the pyramids like this, the distance between what I know and what every American citizen knows and what the president knows is very large. But that morning, we all knew just about the same, which wasn't much. And you can see that on the president's face, and you can see it in his demeanor as the day progresses. He's trying to get up to speed. He is trying to summon the government and this vast array of capabilities to give him something more to work with. But in those early moments, he looks just like us. Now, some people criticize him for that. Oh, he doesn't know what to do. Honestly, would you have known what to do? He was very close to us, probably closer than any president has emotionally in my lifetime. And that is a reminder constantly to me that there are moments in which a presidency can be very close to us. And when a president of any party plays what we have now come to regard as the really important consoling part of this job. It's not historically been a part of the job, but it is now. You have to hold people. You have to embrace them. You have to do so repeatedly, and you have to do so on camera, whether you're comfortable or they're comfortable. You have to wrap the presidency's arms around suffering Americans. That's another part of the job that does bring that sense of touchability and approachability closer to home. And presidents have to figure out a way to do that and kind of create some emotional space that the public can hold on to. So if they don't, they're out of touch, they're indifferent, they're high and mighty. All bad places for a president to be. So in those two respects, I think I have witnessed and seen how this humanity part of the presidency has become a bit more visible.
You have an anecdote or a story that really captures that for you, Laura?
You know, I actually think about it more in the ways in which they try to elevate themselves as opposed to kind of bring themselves into the same level with the American public. I mean, you can see this almost every year, right? Whether it's the State of the Union or an inaugural address, presidents are working very hard to wrap themselves in the coat that is the presidency and say, follow me. You can trust me. I am here to, help you realize your interests and desires. So I'm also very interested in not just how they maybe are just like the rest of us, but in fact work exceedingly hard to also be more than the best of us.
What do you hope a student can learn and understand so that they can really participate in our country's system? They can understand the presidency and make wise choices when it's their turn to go into the ballot box.
So I think the most difficult thing about the presidency is actually understanding how attached to the political parties it has become. So in the beginning, the framers actually imagined the Electoral College would be something of a nominating process in and of itself. The electors who were meeting in the various states would propose individuals who would be worthy of the presidency. That then would lead to a decision rendered by the House of Representatives among the top 3 or 4 people. As our country has evolved and the political parties have sort of secured the methods of election, the biggest problem we have now is that at the end of the day, anyone can be president, but they can only be president if they win the nomination of one of the 2 major political parties. And those are Duke Professor John Aldrich's words, not mine, but they are incredibly important because what it means is that for our presidency to really, I think, animate the country and be the leader that we need, we actually need them to rise above political party. But the political parties have so taken over the nomination process that there is now sort of almost no way for just your average citizen to participate unless they get in early and support candidates who are not just pandering, but actually have larger visions beyond their party interests.
We set out to do something that at the time was revolutionary. Not revolutionary enough. Lots of people were excluded from our definition of freedom at our inception, no question. But that definition still was broader and more radical than any place else in the world. Again, not close. And that expression created tension about that definition. And we have lived with that tension and enlarged that definition step by step. Not always peacefully, sometimes very painfully, but we've enlarged it. That's part of the experiment. And I would say to any student, as you think about politics in our country, just ask yourself one question. What is my level of satisfaction and what is my level of participation? And I just invite you to lean into participation as you weigh your satisfaction.
Major Laura, thank you for spending the time with us, explaining what you've shared and helping us understand things that you've spent lifetimes.
As you can tell, we kind of like it.
Seems like it. So, thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 4 of Facts About the Founders. If you answered Roger Sherman, the former cobbler, that's a shoemaker, by the way, from Connecticut, then you got the correct answer. The 66-year-old argued for a strong legislative branch and a weaker executive branch. He was also the delegate who proposed what would become known as the Great Compromise, which determined that representation in the legislative branch would be 2 senators for each state in the Senate and proportional representation in the House of Representatives. So that was Roger Sherman. Okay, here we go. Ready for the next question? This is a good one. This one-legged founder, was on the Committee of Style in the drafting of the Constitution. And as such, he was tasked with editing the final language and is credited with having changed the opening words to "We the people of the United States." Who was this founder? Once again, be the first to email me the correct answer at cjansen@mybri.org. That's cjansen@mybri.org, and you will win a box of swag for you and your students. We'll see you back here, guys, in a few minutes with the correct answer.
Welcome to our celebration of Constitution Day 2022. We're excited you're here. And if you just heard Chris ask a question, make sure to get those answers in so that you have a chance of winning some really cool resources from our latest curriculum, The Plainest Demands of Justice. And the box is really cool. I'm really excited about it.
It is a really fun box because it really does get at the question of our Constitution Day activities, which is the Constitution at work. What does it look like? What does it mean? We want to hear from you. We want to hear about how the Constitution is working with you or for you or what you're thinking about. So reach out to us in the stream or the Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're all over the place and we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, and speaking of that, one thing that jumped out at me in that interview with Major and Lara is this idea that it's people. And we just talked about that in our last segment, that the government isn't anything other than people. It's me, it's you, Rachel, it's all of us. And one day it could be you all serving in some kind of public office. And that's really what brings to life the Constitution. We have what Stan was talking about in our first hour, this structural Constitution, kind of the rules for how it is that we're supposed to play things out, how it is we have this structured sort of debate and discussion and how that process plays out. But it's up to us to actually bring it to life.
And it is people. It's people who populate these offices. And I thought there were so many interesting things, especially in Dr. Brown Lara's comments, but I especially was thinking about that idea of being an actor and what it means to inhabit the role that's interesting that we call it the role of the president. We think of it kind of as an abstraction from the individuals in the office. And I thought that was a really fascinating description and discussion, is that idea of the president as an actor filling a role. What did you think?
Yeah, I think so too. And really it's the president putting on sort of a public face. I'm sure that there are days when presidents don't want to get up and go to the office or, like the rest of us. But they have to, and their role is to embody that office, and with it comes a lot of pressure and responsibility, as Major's story about John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed. And as evidence of that pressure, I just wanted to hold up a couple pictures here. We have two pictures of Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th President of the United States, and we have a picture of him in 1860, which was right on the eve of the Civil War, right before he came into office. And then we have another one from 1865. And if you look at those two pictures closely, you can really see, even though they're black and white and they're from well over 150 years ago, you can really see the toll that it took on him as he was guiding the nation through the horrific bloody conflict of the Civil War. And it's a real reminder that these are human beings who occupy these offices and who make these decisions. And the office is actually a reflection of who they are as a person when they are in that seat.
That's a pretty dramatic change, but I also remember people commenting on President Obama's appearance over the course of his presidency and just how the change in the grays happened. So it's still common, it's still happening. These are still individuals who took action to make a contribution to their communities, because public service is really important.
Yeah, and it points to that idea of public service, and people still have to step up to serve as president. And one day, who knows, maybe it'll be one of you who is in that office. But it's important to keep in mind that it is service. And someone who talked a little bit more about that was Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, who we had a chance to have an interview with. And he thinks about this idea of public service in a very real way, and him as a servant kind of gets into it. So let's take a look at what he had to say.
As you've described it, there is a trunk to these branches, and that trunk is the people whose authority the government is using and acting on. We are represented that way. how do we as a people adjust and change our expectations and communicate those expectations in a way that can help improve some of the things you've described?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I have three thoughts. The first is we need to do things like you all are doing today and your students watching this are doing, which is we need to familiarize ourselves with our constitutional framework, because it's a pretty darn glorious inheritance to believe that people are created in the image of God with natural rights that predate government, and government isn't the center of our community. It isn't the center of our identity. Government is a tool, and it's supposed to secure our freedoms. And so constitutional education and civics are pretty darn important. Second, I think we need more people to run for office, and in particular, to think of it as a service calling for a short time and then go back to the rest of their lives. We shouldn't have the professionalization of politics where a small set of people become politicians and they stay for their whole life. People should only go to Washington for a limited time and then they should go back home. George Washington obviously was a pretty great exemplar of this tradition. In 1796, at the end of Washington's second term, when he decided to step down, he gave this farewell address to the country. In Lin-Manuel Miranda's telling, Hamilton is his muse, and it's the song Teach Him How to Say Goodbye. And Washington wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, not just because he preferred to be in Mount Vernon, where he was from and running his farm, but also because he didn't think Washington, D.C. should be an example of a place you aspire to go to. This is the heights of community and meaning, and then you want to stay there forever. And so we need more people to expect that politicians would only serve for a little while and then go home, not try to be perpetual incumbents. And then third, I think we do need to have much better media consumption habits around how we think about politics. Politics is not like sports. It's not, as I say this as a son of a football coach and a lifelong wrestler. Sports are a lot more interesting than politics. And when people try to cover politics as a boxing match and as a horse race, it leads us to do and say and feel stupid things about tribe. I want Republicans and Democrats to differ about some policy issues and then set it aside and go have a beer together and break bread together. And, maybe some people are Packers fans and some people are Chiefs fans, but you wouldn't need to sort your community based on your political tribal loyalties. And right now we have too many folks who think if you're going to do politics, you got to do it as blood sport. And if you don't want to do it as blood sport, then you shouldn't be involved at all. What we need is a lot more regular people to show up and roll their eyes at the weirdos in politics. We need a lot more regular people to say, one cheer for politics, not three cheers. This isn't the center of life, but not zero cheers either. Maintaining a framework for ordered liberty and thanking our troops for all they do to put themselves in harm's way to defend our freedoms. Those are pretty important responsibilities, but it's like eating vegetables. It shouldn't be cotton candy, and it shouldn't be your evening recreation. You should put in a little bit of time to be knowledgeable about the issues. We should thank those who serve on our behalf, and then you should go build communities of love and persuasion that are a hell of a lot more interesting than politics.
Senator, as you go about your work, you've expressed several times your appreciation for the Constitution. As you face decisions on a routine basis, what are the principles and ideas that you turn to frequently as your touchstones in decision making?
Yeah, so Donald Rumsfeld, now dead, but formerly Secretary of Defense, but long before that, Princeton wrestler, and then a congressman from Illinois. He would say, before I'm ever going to vote for anything that gives the federal government new power, first I want to understand, is the federal government permitted to do this thing? Is this an authority that the Constitution has given to the federal government? If not, I can't be for it. Even if it is a permissible power, is it possible that the private sector can solve this problem? Because if the private sector can solve it instead of the public sector, then I'd rather not have the public sector crowd out the private sector. The private sector allows more failure and more diversity. And I mean failure in a good way. You want lots of restaurants in your community to not be decreed by the government. There will be one restaurant and it will be Italian and it will be open 5 days a week for these hours. You'd rather have an entrepreneurial market of a whole bunch of people figuring out who makes better food and is open the right hours and gives great customer service that's high quality at a low cost. And you'd like a diversity of options for the public. And so you'd prefer private to public sector, both for-profit entities and not-for-profit entities. of stuff that happens in the public sector, is it possible that we can solve this problem at the state and local level? If so, again, we should prefer to do that because it allows more diversity. The founders used this phrase, they didn't say 50 laboratories of democracy, but they referred to the states as laboratories of democracy because the 13 then, the 50 now, we have very different communities, problems, strengths, weaknesses. Nebraska and Vermont have very different farming. Vermont has darn great gardens, but Nebraska feeds the world. And so the regulatory framework that you're going to use for a cattle operation in Nebraska, we're by far the largest cattle state in the union. The regulations you're going to use about how to manage rainwater runoff from a manure pile at a place that has 10,000 head of cattle so that the toxicity of the rainwater runoff from that manure pile doesn't poison somebody else's corn and bean row cropping operation down the hill. That's going to be different than the way you should regulate agriculture in Vermont. And so I want a diversity of options, public and private versus public sector, and state and local government versus federal. And then at the federal level, there should be a small number of things we do. The most important one should center around our common defense, national security, and intelligence issues. And we should make sure that there are opportunities for proof of concept and for trial projects and for renewal. We shouldn't authorize programs of the federal government to exist for eternity. We should do them for 1 year or for 3 years or for 5 or 6 years. And we should have those programs set to expire so that then we deliberate again, is this the right way to use the monopolistic powers and the taxing authorities and the prohibitions and the imprisonment powers of the federal government?
What is your aspiration for the country that you hope your service leaves for today's young people, for today's students?
Yeah, I think that we are all blessed to grow up in the greatest experiment in liberty and in government and governance in human history. Government is not the center of the world, but this is a pretty amazing experiment. And the fact that it's gone on 240 years would probably surprise our founders. When Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in summer, fall of 1787, there's the apocryphal story of the little old lady who wandered up to him and said, "What kind of government did you give us?" Because many people still thought we'd end up with a monarchy. And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." And Ronald Reagan was enshrining that same principle when he regularly said, freedom is always one generation away from extinction in the American experiment. And he didn't mean that as a pessimistic comment. He meant your grandma and your grandpa can't preserve liberty for you. We don't believe in an autocratic, centrally planned state. We believe we, the people, are responsible to pass along freedom to the next generation. It doesn't happen in the bloodstream. It happens by our civics. And that requires us to celebrate and to feel gratitude for what we've inherited and what we get to experience. And one more, George Washington, that Abraham Lincoln explained so well and extrapolated upon. George Washington would say that our constitutional structure and our federal government are a silver frame, but the golden apple at the center of the frame is the things you use your freedom for. We want government to maintain freedom. You want government to make sure it's not dangerous to walk home from a restaurant late at night. We want a police force that maintains order in those streets so people are safe and secure as they walk home. But government isn't the thing you fall in love with. Government is a means to the end. And so the silver frame is the thing that makes it possible, the framework for ordered liberty. The golden apple is the things you build. It's your new mousetrap, it's your new app, it's your startup enterprise, it's the Rotary Club, it's the church or the synagogue where you invite people to worship with you, it's the people you try to persuade to marry you, it's the people you invite over for dinner. The great things in life are done by persuasion and love, and the American system enables that because of the silver frame, which is the constitutional structure that recognizes the inherent dignity of all 330 million people created in God's image. And I guess what I would aspire to is sitting here in 2022, that we would look forward to 2032 and we would be able to say more of our students and more of the next generation feel that gratitude, understand that inheritance, and are in love with the constitutional framework because of the liberty and the possibility that it creates in the community and the neighborhoods where you're raising your kids, because that's the center of meaning, not Washington, D.C.
Senator, we thank you for your time today and especially for your service to our country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stan. Great to be with you all.
Welcome back to the Bill of Rights Institute's Constitution Day live programming, where we're examining the Constitution at work. We just heard from Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, and his work on thinking about his own role as a senator, but also encouraging young people to see their civic engagement as an act of service. So that was a reflection that Major Garrett actually gave us in the past videos, where he asked us, what is my level of satisfaction and what is my level of participation? And I think that's such an important question for all of us, but especially for young people as they come into their citizenship as adults in our community. What stood out to you, Kirk?
Yeah, that government as service idea, and I really do think it's something we should all keep in mind. Being an elected official is tough in the sense that you hear a lot of opinions from a lot of people all of the time. And you have to listen to those different opinions and try to find a way to move forward in the best way possible. But it can be harsh, and frankly, it should be to a certain extent. We need to hold our elected officials accountable. So those kinds of voicing opinions, especially when people are angry and frustrated, is an important part of the process. But the people who are volunteering to go and sit in those chairs and try to find solutions, it's an ennobling thing, and really it is a service that they are dedicating themselves to. And it's helpful to keep that in mind because it's a hard job. But you know, it reminds me, Rachel, and this is a program that you run here at the Bill of Rights Institute, called My Impact Challenge, which isn't quite about elected officials necessarily doing things, but how it is that you as individuals can be involved in your community. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, because it is so exciting. It is such a great program for any young people any young person who's interested in being active and engaged in their community in a meaningful and robust way. So the My Impact Challenge is a national service learning civic engagement contest from the Bill of Rights Institute. So if you are interested in making a change, having an impact in your community, you can submit a project to our contest. We have $40,000 in prizes, the top of which is a $10,000 prize. And teachers and support adults also have prizes to win if you're encouraging your students or young people in your lives to submit projects. What are these projects? Well, they can really be anything. One of the things that BRI recognizes, the Bill of Rights Institute recognizes, is that our civic engagement really comes in the form of 3 pillars, and we kind of think about it that way. The first is this idea that there is government action that sometimes needs to take place. There is a role of government in our lives, and sometimes it's just something that needs to change. The second is an entrepreneurial activity. Sometimes a business needs to step in, and there needs to be someone who innovates to create a product that serves a need. Or sometimes it's just charity, something that you're doing that serves people directly. That is, all those kinds of projects are able to submit for the My Impact Challenge. It's a really simple application. You can go to myimpactchallenge.org. There's a link below, and we would love to hear and see what you're doing in your community, how engaged you are, the impact you're having. We just launched on September 11th, and the contest this year will close May 21st, so you have some time to get your contest entries in.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it really is amazing how much of an impact we can all have in our communities if we get to work. And that, again, is our theme for today, the Constitution at Work. And you know, one of those things that work involves is persuasion. In one of our earlier segments, John Schaff mentioned this idea of if you want to persuade a man, first you must become his friend. And the idea is you have to understand someone if you want to persuade him. And speaking of which, we have another conversation with those two that we're now going to feature, where John Schaff and Dan Mahoney are going to be looking at how that persuasion can work, but also, again, what it means to be a statesman, what it is to guide the nation through certain difficult decisions. And they're going to particularly look at the Emancipation Proclamation, which I talked about a little bit earlier today. So let's take a look.
So, John, the Emancipation Proclamation has really come under a great deal of scrutiny, perhaps even criticism in recent years. Mm-hmm. You know, in thinking about his statesmanship, how does Lincoln combine the principles of the moral law, of understanding that slavery is morally wrong, with the prudence and restraint of a constitutional statesman with the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, I think probably if there are probably two complaints about the Emancipation Proclamation. One is, the argument of Richard Hofstadter in the mid 20th century that it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, which means like a sales receipt, basically. And then the argument that you're probably more referring to, the contemporary argument, is that it didn't really free the slaves. It didn't go far enough. It was too restrained. So let's take some of those in turn. Well, Lincoln didn't use poetry in the Emancipation Proclamation because he wanted it to be seen as a legal action. Lincoln had argued that a constitutional amendment or possibly compensated emancipation are the only way constitutionally to get rid of slavery. But in the midst of war, he argued that as a war measure, using his commander-in-chief power, he could emancipate slaves under certain conditions, which I'll get to in a second. And so the wording of the document is a legal document. It's not a poetic document that we normally expect from Lincoln, especially when he's dealing with slavery. And so, but other people, the argument is that it didn't go far enough. So just recall that slaves in various states, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, were still in the Union. And they were not freed by the proclamation, as well as areas under Union control, parts of the Confederacy under Union control. Well, again, Lincoln is issuing this as a war measure. Therefore, he doesn't think that it pertains to those places not at war with the United States, with the Union. And so, his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, criticized him for not going further. Chase, an abolitionist, and Lincoln simply responded. I'll quote from him when he said, "What defense is there of an extension beyond where he had these areas that were at war with the United States? Quote, except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right. Would I not thus give up all footing upon constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? Could this pass unnoticed or unresisted?" He simply didn't think he had the legal authority to free all slaves, which is why he supported the 13th Amendment, because it did free all slaves. And then he wasn't sure the Emancipation Proclamation would be good law once conflict was over. And so the 13th Amendment deals with this question of when hostilities are done, now what's the status of slaves? Well, the 13th Amendment deals with that.
Lincoln provides us with a really an unparalleled example of unity, a spirit of a common purpose. Again, in the beautiful and eloquent second inaugural address, which we've alluded to, how does he seek to bind the nation together in that common set of ideals, that common purpose that can provide maybe a strong example for us today?
Well, I mean, I guess an answer to that would be in part speculative, but I think we can see in the Gettysburg Address of November 1863 and the second inaugural, sort of a two-thronged effort to encourage what Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address had called a new birth of freedom. And a new birth of freedom necessarily entailed some active effort, not only to abolish chattel slavery, but to make blacks full or fuller participants in the American Republic. I think once Lincoln made that decision to arm free blacks and have them fight for union and liberty, once blood was shed on behalf of common principle and common purpose, there was no going back. And we know 4 days before Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, he delivered a speech on the franchise in Louisiana where I think it shows where he was heading. He didn't call for universal suffrage for ex-slaves or for blacks, but he called for black suffrage, and I think he alludes to essentially the most educated. I think he wanted a gradual approach, not the sort of heavy-handed approach pursued by radical Republicans after 1866, but he wanted a prudent approach that was unequivocal in its recognition of common citizenship, but that recognized, I guess, there were some preconditions of that. and there may be a transition, and one has to deal, of course, with white opinion. Even Lincoln was good at that because, Lincoln, in the Lincoln Douglas debates or many of the speeches he gave in Illinois in the late 1850s, he was dealing with a free soil population that was anti slavery, but by today's standards, racist. And so most of those lines or qualifications that are always conditional, where you don't have to buy, just because you can't enslave, you have no right to enslave a black woman doesn't mean you have to marry her. My students look at that and say, this horrible racist. This was a statesman trying to get people who didn't want too much, interplay between black and white populations to at least recognize the starting point, the humanity of the black man and woman, and then the follow up to them, their citizenship in a political order dedicated to common purpose. Now, with today, I would say, I think part of what we have to do is recover what I'm going to call the moral grandeur of Lincoln's perspective. And that means recovering the moral grandeur of statesmanlike prudence. It is calamitous, I think, that most intellectuals and most academics and the students who study under them think that the fanaticism of the abolitionists is the moral high ground. And Lincoln's position was much more arduous. It involved much less self-righteousness and moral preening. It involved exactly the coming together of principle and prudence that was needed to address the sectional problem, as well as the problem of chattel slavery. And Lincoln's also very important for us today because he provided an accurate genealogy of the founders' views on slavery. The Cooper's Union address, for example, in New York, is so important because right before the Civil War, Lincoln makes very clear that we have to, at a minimum, remain faithful to the founders' position to put slavery on the road to eventual extinction. And that meant, all the measures that were taken, the abolition of the slave trade, the Northwest Ordinance forbidding slavery in new states and territory, all of that.
And John, last question. So you and Dan write of Lincoln's what's called political or civil religion. What principles and virtues comprise that civil religion, and how could embracing this vision maybe help unify us again more today?
Sure, we've referenced multiple times that Lyceum address, and that's where Lincoln explicitly says that the rule of law should become a political religion. What the founders sacrificed their sacred, their lives and their sacred honor to the Declaration. He says we should do the same for the Constitution, the rule of law more broadly. So there's a concept here of gratitude. Be thankful for and protect that which has been handed down to you, and that's an important virtue. And then, as the subtitle of my book suggests, limits. We need to live within limits. And as I kind of referenced before, we all know when we look into our hearts that we all want things that aren't good for us, even if it's something as mundane as that second donut. It's not good for us. And sometimes it's more morally serious things than donuts. But what does a good parent, pastor, friend, teacher do? They say no to you. And this is what a statesman has to do sometimes, is say no. And this is, I think, at the heart of Lincoln's political religion. Again, partially with the rule of law, that's a big part of it. But also, I think, in that defense of natural right, of which Lincoln's defense of natural equality stems from. So whatever our inequalities, and there are some, they don't translate into a right to rule or the right to have, some people have more rights than other natural rights than other people do. So even if a majority wants something and they think they see it as good and desirable, if it violates the standard of natural justice, then it's wrong. Because there's a standard that's beyond public opinion. And so Lincoln said in that 1854 Peoria address that there has to be a standard of justice beyond self-interest.
Well, Dan Mahoney and John Schaff, I want to thank you very much for joining us as part of our BRI Constitution Day celebration, and you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Jody.
Great, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation with two of our finest scholars to consider these timeless principles for Constitution Day.
Hello, and welcome back to our final hour of Constitution Day Live. Remember, if you know the answer to Chris's trivia questions, make sure you send them in at Chris Janson, that's C. Janson, Janson, at mybri.org, and he'll be getting there. But I am excited to welcome in our next special guest, Mary Patterson. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Happy Constitution Day. I'm delighted to be here.
Mary, you just heard our panel of scholars talking about Lincoln, and this is someone you've been thinking a lot about lately.
It's true. So I recently had a really great conversation with Jen Epstein, who's a ranger with the National Park Service on the National Mall, about the Lincoln Memorial, and we'll get to see that conversation in just a few minutes, so I hope you can stick around.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see that clip because as our two scholars, Dan Mahoney and John Schaff, were just talking, Lincoln's role as president during the crisis of the Civil War was really complicated. And not only was it complicated in the fact that he was guiding the nation through a bloody conflict, but it was also about what is it that we're going to do and take steps on when it comes to the emancipation of the enslaved that were in the South during the Civil War, and then what would happen to the system of enslavement after the war. Lincoln was thinking about and working with answers to all of those really complex questions. And as a nation then, it gets complicated for how we think about Lincoln and how we talk about Lincoln. And as the two scholars touched on, there are quite a few things that Lincoln was putting forward in the way he was going about it that we would see as objectionable and problematic, but that Lincoln was doing as sort of careful political steps, trying to move the nation in a direction that he thought was going to lead to greater equality and greater liberty and greater justice for more people. And as we reflect on that history and the history of many people in our nation, we have to think about how we remember them and how it is that we go about memorializing those people. And in a way, that's also kind of the Constitution at work. But Mary, so what about your experiences with Lincoln in the last few days, or I guess in the last few months as you've been at the Lincoln Memorial, have you been thinking about?
Well, I think, just going back to our scholars, this idea of slow change versus quick change, I think that's a really interesting conversation with Lincoln. And he's there's so many layers, so many facets to Lincoln. There's Lincoln as a man, there's Lincoln as the president. I mean, we've talked about the role as being an actor, right? It's a role that you take on. So all of these things kind of came up in my conversation with Jen at the memorial, and it was great to hear from someone who knows all the ins and outs of the symbolism and what the memorial was meant to say about Lincoln, but also how people today come to think about the memorial and if there's been a change there. So that was really, I think, a highlight for me.
And Lincoln is this great example of the kind of changing thinking about different roles that we've had in our president, different presidential ideas of presidential sensibilities of their own role. Our understanding of the nature of politics has changed, and a lot of that had to do with the controversy in Lincoln and how Lincoln's legacy has played out, right? In different communities, over different time. It went to this idea of mandates and what did Lincoln see as his mandate versus what do we think about Lincoln's mandate looking back on him. So all of this is to say that it really does take work to make sure that we are holding true to our constitutional principles through this abundance of change that has happened over the past, 150, 250 years.
Yeah, and Mary, like you mentioned, and like you kind of alluded to, the Lincoln Memorial is a very interesting place for the cross-section of sort of the Constitution at work, because we're thinking about Lincoln, who he was, and of course, on the walls, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, are two famous speeches by Abraham Lincoln, but also it's a place where we have come to gather as a people and think about both what Lincoln stood for and sort of what he meant, but also what the nation is intended to mean, what those promises laid out in the Declaration of Independence actually are and how we all work to go about achieving them. And in a way, you know, Stan in our first hour mentioned the structural constitution. And again, those are the that's the roadmap, the ground rules for how it is that we have these different interactions between both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then Congress as a whole, and the President, and then the President and Congress and the Supreme Court. All these multiple majorities also that Stan was talking about, like this complex interaction is all laid out in that structural constitution. But fundamentally what it eventually comes down to is individuals showing up and advocating on behalf of the issues that they're passionate about and working to overcome the challenges that they're in community. And again, the Lincoln Memorial is a place where a lot of that action has taken place.
Yes. It's a great example of where that action has taken place. Like, it's built as an actual temple to Abraham Lincoln, and you see his amazing rhetoric that we've mentioned, you know, the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural on the walls. Interestingly, you don't see the Emancipation Proclamation, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our video. But it's a temple to Lincoln, but people come there from all over the world, from all over the country. We were there very early in the morning to have our conversation with Jen, and there were still lots of people coming to the Lincoln Memorial. And I think it's the present, but it's the people, right? It's we the people, it's the trunk of the tree that come here, that advocate for change. We'll talk about some of these gatherings over time in the last 100 years of how people have, you know, wanted to make the Constitution work better for them or be more faithful to founding principles that you see in the Declaration of Independence.
Well, great, Mary. That's really exciting. So can you set this clip up for us? So what's Bridge from the Past?
Sure. So if you're new to Bridge from the Past, we start with an image or a place and use it as a starting point to think about important topics in American history and government. And what I love about Bridge from the Past is that often these questions become evergreen and timeless. So we're thinking about history and memory. Why was the Lincoln Memorial built? It's celebrating its 100th birthday this year. It was dedicated in 1922. And has that meaning changed over time? So Ranger Jen will talk us through the dedication ceremony, how it was built, all of the symbolism in the architecture, the myth of Lincoln's hands. Is he signing AL, as people like to say, or does it mean something else? And how the meaning and the dedication of the memorial is really, I think, still going. And that, to me, is what is really beautiful and I think really powerful about this place, this special place on the National Mall, which belongs to all of us. It's not just about Lincoln, it's about us.
Great. Well, let's take a look.
Hi everybody, welcome to a very special episode of Bridge from the Past. I'm your host, Mary, and this series is all about using images or places to help us make sense of America's past. I'm standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And I'm not alone. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jennifer Epstein of the National Park Service. Ranger Jen is here to help me make sense of this special place. What can we learn about Lincoln by visiting the Lincoln Memorial? But not just Lincoln. What could we learn about ourselves and our role in our constitutional system? Let's jump in and see. Jen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, happy to be here.
I would like to start with your story, if you don't mind. So we're really big on stories here at the Bill of Rights Institute. So how did you come to be in your role as a park ranger here on the mall?
I was inspired by my 5th grade teacher to get into the field of history. I don't know what she did, I don't know how she did it, but somehow after 5th grade, I just knew I wanted to do something with history. And I visited a lot of historic sites, and I met a lot of park rangers over the years. And when I went to college in a historic town, it was an opportunity to volunteer with the Park Service, and just got me started from there. And I just feel like in my job I get to be, hopefully, that inspiration to new students that my teacher was to me. And that's kind of what motivates me to want to tell the stories, because that's what we do too, is tell stories, and that's what we like to do.
So let's jump into the story of Lincoln itself. So what is the symbolism in the architecture of this monument?
So this memorial is built 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the big theme of this memorial was all about unity, and the idea that President Lincoln helped to unify the country, continue the Civil War to get the country back together, from the number of columns around the outside to the states around the top. There's a lot of symbols of unity, and that's really what they were going for when they designed this memorial.
So you mentioned this theme of unity. So other than the states' names around the monument itself, how else did they build on this theme of unity in designing the monument?
Yeah, one of the things I think you don't realize when you're looking at this is that the rock that forms the memorial came from 6 different states. And that was another way of incorporating unity, because they could say that the rock and the memorial was literally built out of rock that came from all parts of the country, some from the north and some from the south. So the statue of Lincoln is made of Georgia marble, while the outside is Colorado Yule marble, and there's Alabama marble in the ceiling, and there's Tennessee on the floor, but there's Massachusetts granite, and it's just a really neat way to say, look, we built this memorial and it literally is out of, represents a united nation.
I'm curious about the location of the memorial. So we're here on the National Mall, and the Washington Monument is here, the Capitol is here. What was the significance of placing the memorial on this site?
So in Lincoln's day, this site would not have been here. This would have been part of the Potomac River. And so this is all reclaimed land. The river went almost up into where the Washington Monument is today. And so it was actually a bit of a controversy deciding to put the Lincoln Memorial here, because this had just been reclaimed land in the late 1800s, and there was nothing out here. And there were members, a particular member of Congress, who was very upset at the idea that they were going to build a memorial to honor President Lincoln in the middle of this swamp.
That's so interesting about the Potomac River. So the Potomac River is behind the Lincoln Memorial, and just across the river is Virginia, which would have been the Confederacy at the time of the Civil Wars.
And one of the best views that I'm not sure people always think about is when you come up here to visit, and I hope you do if you haven't had a chance to come visit, is to go up the steps and turn to the left or right and go around the backside of the Lincoln, because you then can see that view of Virginia. And imagine if you're President Lincoln's day, Virginia is who you're fighting in the Civil War, and look how close you are, and you really get that perspective from the backside of the Lincoln. That's
a really powerful idea, again, of unity. You have this conflict, this union, like torn asunder, and this president that was saving the union. That's really lovely.
And you're talking about places, and you just see how close it is.
Right.
And another theme of unity is the bridge behind us, known as the Arlington Memorial Bridge, was built in the 1930s to connect DC and Virginia. And so it's literally that connection again of unity, reuniting the North and the South. And if you follow that bridge, it leads you to Arlington National Cemetery, and the house up on the hill was that of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee is the general who President Lincoln is fighting against. There's all kinds of amazing historical connections in this one spot, and so it is this power of place.
Yeah, history is all around us all the time, as I used to always say to my students. I'd like to ask you about the central hall. If you go up the steps into the memorial itself, you see a very large statue of Abraham Lincoln. So what is the significance of the statue, him being seated, the epitaph or inscription above his head?
Sure, yeah. So the sculptor of the statue, the designer, was Daniel Chester French, a very well-known artist of his day, and his original sculpture was much smaller. He made a model of it, and he brought it to Washington to see how it looked in the building, and it was way too small. It was about half the size of the current statue, and so it didn't quite fit, and he had to make his statue bigger, and so the model was nearly doubled to what you have today. As his head to toe is 19 feet. And he sits on an 11-foot pedestal, so like 30 feet from when you're standing there. But yeah, it really had to do a little bit with the building. And you know, I tell students all the time, you walk up all those steps, you want to be rewarded by what you see. You don't want to just see a tiny little statue of Lincoln. You need to see a big statue. I walked up all those steps, and so I think that had a lot to do with it. The seated versus standing. There's so many columns in the building that I think the artist was afraid if he was standing, he might just kind of blend in with the columns, and so part of that design choice was having him be seated, and that kind of pose there.
One of the things that strikes me about the statue of Lincoln is how serious his face looks, and I always interpreted that as, you know, he's the president during this incredibly stressful time of conflict, and it's meant to convey like almost the burden of the presidency. Am I in left field there?
No,
do you think that's
in
right?
fact, for specifically the hands too, because one of the hands is in a fist and one of the hands is open, and that was done deliberately by the artist because he wanted to show, as you said, that stress of sending soldiers off to fight and the falling apart of the country. That was a very stressful thing to deal with. But he was also had a great sense of humor, and he loved to have his children come play during cabinet meetings, which probably drove everybody else in the cabinet crazy. But the hands are specifically done so that one is in a fist to represent that stress, and the other is the more relaxed, I'd like to think, fun-loving guy who would tell jokes and things like that. We had a lot of people who think that's the myth of the sign language, and he's doing his initials as an A and an L, and that was not intentional. That's not what it's supposed to represent. It's really the moods you described being about the idea of the stress versus the more relaxed man.
I love the actual intent behind the hands more than the myth of the sign language, because when I think of Abraham Lincoln, I think of a penny, and he's very serious, and he's like this great big man, this larger than life man that you see with this giant statue in the memorial. But I also love the humanizing part of it, which I don't think you hear as much, that he had a great sense of humor, which is so crucial. Another thing you can't miss when you go inside the Central Hall are the speeches of Lincoln on either side. Of course, the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural. What was the significance of putting those two particular speeches on the wall?
I think they were just the ideas that are so connected with Lincoln. The idea of the Gettysburg Address, it's this famous speech he gave at the dedication of the cemetery in Gettysburg after the battle, months after the battle, and he thought he wouldn't be remembered and that everyone would forget what he said, and it's become the most famous speech. So those ideas really important. He quotes the Declaration of Independence, and he's talking about equality, so that's an important idea. And then his second inaugural, just 6 weeks before his death, he's again talking about what's going to be the future, and that we need to heal the wounds and come back together again. If you're coming to this memorial, these are the ideas that people want to walk away with and be reinforced about, that what Lincoln means to us as a nation.
I've never not been here and not have a huge crowd, and you can tell there are obviously people coming from other countries. So I think it's meaningful not just for people in the United States to visit, but as you said, people around the world as well. Another thing that's really striking to me about going into the memorial itself is this epitaph, the inscription over the statue of Lincoln, which reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." You have some really powerful words here, like temple, enshrined. So you can see this idea of unity was really a big deal.
So yeah, that statement was written by an art critic at the time who wanted to capture kind of the sentiments of what this memorial is supposed to be about. But I think what's really significant as we look back 100 years is what's not included in that statement. The emphasis again on unity, temple, which relates back to the architecture piece that you mentioned, that we're talking about what kind of building this is. But yeah, no mention of the equality or emancipation, which are key ideas. If you ask any student out there today, why do we have this Lincoln Memorial? It's often goes back to the Emancipation Proclamation or the idea of Lincoln working to help end slavery, and that's not at all included in much of what's in this memorial.
Yeah, well, you mentioned, in the speech of the Gettysburg Address, he quotes the Declaration of Independence, and in his second inaugural, he's looking to the future. So this idea of it was designed with unity, but moving forward, that could perhaps change over time.
Sure.
And as you said, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the memorial's dedication. So do you think the meaning of the memorial has changed over time?
It's funny, as I was listening to you talk, I was taken back to one of the speeches at the dedication was by President Warren Harding, everyone's favorite president, right? But Warren Harding at the dedication said, and I may slightly get it wrong, but something to the effect of, this memorial is more for future generations than it is for today. And so that's kind of interesting that he was even thinking ahead, that this is about what it's going to be, for future generations. I may have this totally wrong, but to me, I don't think many people are coming here today for this idea of unity as much as they are this idea of freedom. And we see that really change over time with events that have happened here. I think our audience probably is familiar with some of the things that have happened here over the years. Certainly Dr. King and the March on Washington in 1963, very famous concert in 1939 with Marian Anderson, who was denied the chance to perform nearby because of her race, and 75,000 people came out to listen to her. I recommend Googling her and watching her on YouTube because it's a really a neat event. But that really changes the face of this memorial, and we start using this as a site for demonstrations and rallies and things like that. And it now is much more, I think, associated with freedom than maybe it is unity. And maybe they all kind of blend together in these times. But when you look at the dedication of this memorial, the audience was segregated. I mean, that's not equality represented 100 years ago. It was definitely about unity. And now we see events happening here that really show this is more about Lincoln's legacy of freedom for all.
One of the things I love about the memorial is that even at the dedication in 1922, one of the speakers is, he's the president of the Tuskegee Institute, and he's talking about this idea. It's almost like a call that things need to be worked on. It's almost as if those events are additional dedications of the memorial over time, and how it's really about, a call to us as Americans that there's always work to be done, there's always progress to be made, and the work is really unfinished.
Yeah, that's so true. There was an African-American newspaper known as the Chicago Defender in 1922, after the dedication, said this memorial hasn't officially been dedicated because of the way the dedication was run, because of the fact there was the segregated audience, because Dr. Moten had to get his speech approved and then changed before he could deliver it. So yeah, there were some who saw it as not officially being dedicated. It may be opened but not dedicated, I think, are the words that this newspaper used. And many looked at this as a celebratory event, the opening of this memorial, and others didn't. And so perspective is a really important part of all of this.
Well, perspective is so important in history, and I think history is really for the future. Like, we study the past to inform the present and the future, and I feel like the Lincoln Memorial is such a wonderful encapsulation of that story. Right? We have these wonderful ideas in the Declaration of Independence, which Abraham Lincoln quotes, which Dr. Martin Luther King quotes, that are ideals that we're always striving for, and we fall short and we continue to fall short, but there's always work to be done. And I think that's really, really beautiful and really powerful. Well, speaking of stories, I think our story is coming to a close here. There's so much more to say and so much more to learn. Jen, where can people go on your website if they want to learn more about the Lincoln or the National Mall?
Sure. Our Lincoln Memorial website is nps.gov/LINC. And my job is as an education specialist, which means that I'm available for field trips and planning with teachers or doing virtual programs, which now we do. So happy to engage with any of y'all if you're looking for programs related to the Lincoln Memorial or any of the sites here on the National Mall. Our main site, nps.gov/NAMA, N-A-M-A.
Okay, great. So we started by asking what visiting this place could tell us not only about Abraham Lincoln, but about us and our role in our constitutional system. And we learned about the symbolism of unity and the design of the memorial, but the memorial is really, I think, more about just one man, as extraordinary as Abraham Lincoln really was. It's a memorial for us, right? To remind us that our work is ongoing, our story is ever-changing, and we are a crucial part of that. And these ideals in the Declaration of Independence, in the Gettysburg Address, in Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, they're for us and the future as well. Jen, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
I hope you guys learned something. If you did learn something, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll help you with all sorts of questions related to history and civics throughout the school year. I'll be back soon with another image or place to help us think about the importance of America's history. As always, everybody, keep your eyes open, keep asking questions, and until next time, take care.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. That was such a wonderful tour, so knowledgeable, so interesting.
Yeah, it really was. And all this thinking about the past is reminding me of something that we always need to touch on whenever we're talking about not only the Constitution, but civics in general. And that is one of the important parts of the Constitution at Work, the future. And so, Mary, you've worked with students for a long time, and even in your conversation there with the park ranger, I could see you thinking through, how it would be to see that for the first time, which many students who come to Washington, D.C. on their field trips do. And so, what strikes you, as we think about the future and come to the end of Constitution Day, in thinking about students?
I think that students are, they're so varied and they're so diverse and they're so unique, and that's that's a metaphor for our country, right? It's we the people, and you are the people. And if you're in school right now, you are in what Stephen Breyer called the nursery of democracy. It's like a training ground for real life. You're going to be with people with different passions, different interests, and I think that's what's exciting to me, is that it's not just about people who love history and who love civics. Some people love music, some people love science, some people love technology, engineering. It takes all sorts. And I always liked learning that about my students. And I have students today who've gone on, who've graduated, who really enjoyed being in my history class, but they're into engineering, or they're into law, or they're into medicine. And it's really amazing and powerful and humbling, and that's the future, right? As the preamble of the Constitution says, we are looking to our posterity, and that's you guys, right? There's way more to come than has already been.
And that's probably why we get into teaching, right? So I was a classroom educator for many years, and it's an act of optimism. It's an act of hoping and thinking that the future citizens that you're helping to learn to self-govern will take America into whatever is next, into that growth and that continued prosperity that we all seek. And that starts, that work starts early, right? The work of the Constitution, I mentioned it much earlier, is, saying on the playground, it's a free society, or it's a free country. They don't say it's a free society, that'd be a little advanced, but it's a free country. And what's so hard today for so many young people is that they really do lack opportunities to be in positions of leadership, to practice those skills and habits in that nursery. What is the soil that they're able to play in to learn those skills and habits of freedom and democracy and classical liberalism? So I think a lot about that, with the consolidation of school districts, how students don't have as much opportunity for student government, or with how large a lot of sports teams are, students don't have an opportunity for leadership. But there are students that find a way, and our next segment is going to be student leaders that the Bill of Rights Institute has been engaging with. But first, I wanted to take a moment to talk about how each of us found leadership opportunities in our community as we were growing up to become the civic educators we now are. So first I want to start with Kirk. What are some civic kind of leadership opportunities that you engaged with?
Sure, so I did a lot of different things. I have varied interests. So when I was growing up, one thing I learned pretty early on was that it was always important to put myself in uncomfortable situations. Especially early on, leadership was an uncomfortable kind of thing for me to do. So I got involved in student government when I was in high school, and then when I got to college, I became involved. I was president of my fraternal organization, which gave me the opportunity to be in a group of young men and try to lead them in a way that was achieving cool things in the community. So every year we would do big philanthropy projects and different charity projects. And so those are two ways that I found, that I could both practice being within a public community, but also what it means to work with individuals who have different perspectives and ideas and try to get them organized around one coherent mission, which may be raising money for the local volunteer fire departments and a few other things that we used to raise money for. So it was a really cool opportunity. Mary, how about you?
Well, as I mentioned, so I always thought I was going to be a musician growing up, and music was one of my big passions. And I was really involved with music. I was in all these different orchestras and bands and things like that. And I actually started to teach flute lessons to young kids when I was in high school. So I was very entrepreneurial, if I do say so myself. And I went around and I met with, band directors at local middle schools, and I introduced myself, and I made a flyer, and this is how you can contact me, and these are all my qualifications. And I started teaching flute lessons in my home. And it was a real joy to share something that I was passionate about, and to see, younger kids just starting out and starting to get the hang of it. And when they did finally get the hang of it, because it's tricky, it was really, really rewarding. And to me, I think that's a good example of it doesn't have to be a big thing, right? I mean, not everyone's going to be the president, not everyone's going to be in Congress, but it starts small, right? We're the trunk of the tree, we the people, we support the branches. So it could be something small, like maybe you're one of those, people in the audience or listening to a talk, or you go to a protest, or you do something small that resonates with you, and that is so important and that matters. And I was just teaching flute lessons to like 5 kids. That's not a huge thing, but I was putting some good out there into the community. So it's something that I am proud of and can look back on as an example of being civically engaged. What about you, Rachel?
Well, so I had a really wonderful opportunity to start volunteering really young. My family with our synagogue would volunteer on Christmas and Thanksgiving to help in different organizations so that the Christian population didn't have to do the volunteering during that time. And then I went on to continue that work in charity throughout my career. I organized college to go to Hurricane Katrina cleanup, and I did an experiential learning project with inner city kids to go to the Dominican Republic. And so that's really been a value that I've had for a really long time, which leads me to kind of thinking about how we all contribute, how we all make the Constitution work. We mentioned in an earlier segment this opportunity for My Impact Challenge. What I love about the 3 examples that we have is it actually mirrors what My Impact Challenge is all about, which is finding a solution that can take many forms to the problems that you've identified in your community. And whether that problem is little kids need some more support with their music, or the fraternity needs some leadership to really do good, or the Hurricane Katrina needs human bodies to help other people like get their lives back in order. We all found space to do that in meaningful ways, and that's what we've had the opportunity to do here at the Bill of Rights Institute over the past year. We actually had our inaugural cohort of the Bill of Rights Institute Student Fellows. So this next segment is going to be all about them and looking at their experience and their goals. And one of the participants said this about their experience, that their goal when applying for the fellowship was to have a deeper understanding of our nation, its ideals, and our role within it. These themes are constant conversations we must have with ourselves, and the more people we speak to, the more ideas that come across. She said, I was so incredibly satisfied with my time in the fellowship, not only because I met educators and mentors who have engendered growth through meaningful questions, but my fellow fellows have opened my mind in many great and unexpected ways. Let's hear what these young people have to say about civic engagement and the future.
Hey guys, welcome back to our 6th and our final episode of the Founders Trivia Challenge. If you answered Elbridge Gerry, you are correct. This cantankerous delegate from Massachusetts definitely was wary of creating a too powerful federal government. And even though he was the chair of the committee that drafted the Great Compromise, which provided for equal representation of the states in the Senate, 2 senators, and proportional representation in the House, in the end, he refused to sign the Constitution. All right, guys, if you enjoyed learning some of these fast facts about just a handful of the fascinating characters involved in the first great drama of the Constitutional Convention, we hope that you will explore the profiles that you can find on our Founders in the Constitution resource. Now, I have a final challenge for everyone. And this challenge actually starts with a story that you may have heard before, so bear with me if you have. Benjamin Franklin had noted that the ornate carved wooden chair that President George Washington was sitting in during the summer of 1787 had a bright sun carved into the back. And he is said to have wondered at times whether or not this sun was a rising sun or a setting sun. It's said that after the Constitution was signed, 235 years ago tomorrow, Franklin was heard to remark optimistically that he now believed that it was indeed a rising sun. So here's our challenge to you today. If you're looking at that sun today, like Franklin, for you, is it a rising sun or is it a setting sun? We want you to share your thoughts with us in a short paragraph by emailing me at cjanson@mybri.org. That's cjanson, Janson, at mybri.org. And we want to share those thoughts on our website. And the first 5 people who share with us your reflections on this final challenge will receive a box of BRI swag. So we want to thank you guys for joining us today and wish each and every one of you a happy Constitution Day.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are really excited to be hosting this segment for Constitution Day Live. I'm Rachel Davison Humphreys, and I'm joined today by a really remarkable group of young people to talk about civic engagement, civic participation, and what they're excited about for the future of America. I'd like to take a moment for us to introduce you all to a select group of our 2021-2022 Bill of Rights Institute Student Fellows. Hi, guys. I'd like you to take a moment just to introduce yourselves. Tell us where you're from and what grade you're in.
All right. Hi, I'm Sam Underhill. I'm from Newcastle, Indiana. I go to Newcastle High School here, and I'm currently a senior.
Hi, my name is Estrella. I'm a senior from Cesar Chavez, located in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carson. I go to La Jolla Country Day School out in San Diego, California.
Hi, I'm Aiden Smith. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, and currently I'm a freshman at the University of Alabama.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bailey Dobratz. I'm from Rye, Wisconsin, but currently I'm a freshman at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Hi, I'm Taryn. I'm a current senior at Mount St. Mary Academy in New Jersey.
I had the deep pleasure and honor of working with these young people over the course of the school year last year, culminating in a trip to end our experience together to Washington, D.C., where we had amazing conversations about civic engagement, civic participation, civic leadership, and the future of America. And we wanted to take a few minutes today just to talk with young people from around the country about why civic participation is important today. Why is it important that young people know their role in society and take a role in society?
So I think it's important for young people to engage in civics because when young people engage in civics, we represent a huge part of the population in America. And it helps when we come together and discuss our opinions with each other just to improve our outlook and improve what we want for our American future. And also it helps represent a huge part of the American population.
Kind of to go off what you said, Sam, it's just, it's really helpful, at least for me as a young person, just getting to be involved, because the truth is I don't know everything. Obviously, I have lived long enough to make my own experiences and my own beliefs about certain things, but being able to have that discourse and get involved, it helps me grow, and it helps me share with others what I've learned to possibly help them grow.
As more people get involved in politics and local level stuff, I think it sets the ground for that generation to start moving in as each generation had done before. Like the old generations had come in just based on their own participation in different movements. And now just to see like our generation doing the same thing it's both inspiring and it makes me excited just for the future of youth engagement and just the future of our country in general.
I feel like politics, sort of like everyone else was saying, constitutes so much of our lives. The decisions that are made on the level of local governments and federal governments are just like, they have so much impact upon us that like we don't even know sometimes or don't even realize. And I think the diversity of opinions that we all have is really important so we can engage in civil discourse, which is one of the bedrocks of our democracy. And because of that, I think it's really important that everyone, especially youth, remain civically engaged and understand what's going on around them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like with what Carson said, it's essential young people like us are going to be involved in civic participation, because at the end of the day, it's going to be us who's going to be making all the decisions in the in this country.
I also agree. We make big changes even if we don't notice them. Like we're changing like statues that are around the nation, like some of them are being removed because of how they impacted like the later generation, and the newer generation like has made more changes to like make this country more diverse and more open to people's opinions and like ideals. So yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much. Those are great answers, and it's clear that you've thought about this a lot. So what's inspiring you right now, either around your generation or what's happening in the world or our experiences together as fellows?
Well, I mean, most of us are either of voting age or able to vote soon, and I think that's pretty exciting. I mean, ever since I was younger, I've been hearing about elections, whether it's like for the president or for like the mayor in my town. I feel like being able to participate in something that I feel like is so present everywhere is really significant. So I'm excited to be able to participate more in democracy.
I think what I'm the most excited about is just we've had generations come in and out, and now it's our turn. I think what we're seeing is like more young people having opinions and being able to express what they believe in. And I think now more than ever, young people are at like the forefront. It's really cool just to see like as more people, as more young people come out in terms of politics and their beliefs. It's inspiring to me that we have such like a passionate group of young people coming to the forefront politically, and just to know that that's going to generationally lead the country in the direction. It's exciting.
What excites me most about the future is that I think our generation is unique because it's we're easily the most connected generation in history, and I think that allows us to be much more effective. So as we reach voting age, we're not just focused on the opinions of the people that live in our own areas. We actually know like how the broader country thinks and what other people's experiences are. So that allows us to inform our decision making a lot more. So I think that's going to help improve the decisions that we make as a generation in the future. And that's what excites me the most.
I guess speaking personally, I guess I am technically an adult at this point, and I'm on the cusp of beginning to make my own decisions and sort of be a fully participating member of society. And that can seem intimidating, but at the same time, it is rather exciting to see all the different ways I can just contribute to my country. Voting, we talked a lot about voting, and that's a big part, but also just serving in local communities, getting involved with local governments, if that is voting or working with local representatives. And it's really exciting. I guess I'm technically not youth, but just as I guess you could use the word blossoming adult, it's exciting to see how new things are available to me as I get older.
Now that I'm like closer to being actually legally able to vote, I'm more excited about that because now I can actually input my opinions and decisions on like what I want the country to like move forward in.
One thing for me that I'm excited about now that I've reached that age where I can vote and I'm off to college is I have the opportunity to learn more and be able to formulate my own opinions and listen respectfully to others and figure out why they're thinking the way they are. Already, even at college, I've experienced a lot of new things, stuff I wouldn't have experienced where I was before. So really, like Aiden said, blossoming into an adult, being able to join political organizations, deciding my own opinions. That's what I'm excited for.
I'm really thankful for what Sam shared, that like we really are a very interconnected generation even. And so having that interconnectedness and being able to not only share opinions and learn from the people obviously in our immediate sphere of influence, but people all across the world that have experienced millions of different things than us. It's it's a lot to process, and that's for sure. Especially social media can be hard to navigate at times, but at the same time, it's also really exciting because you get to learn a lot about a lot of different people that have gone through a lot of different things, and issues that you may not have thought of become more prominent, or I guess more clear to you. And suddenly you can sympathize even with people that you've never even met in person.
I feel like definitely the level of interconnectedness is a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing in the sense that people are able to become more informed and make their own decisions, but also a bad thing because I feel like everyone's constantly so exposed to like so many different perspectives, so many like awful things happening every single day that it's sort of difficult to be able to like process it. But it's also important to realize that like no matter what, like you're able to make a change even if it's just in your own community.
I guess one thing is like, obviously, the majority is definitely able to connect globally, is sort of the global community. But at the same time, there's also a lot of people that aren't able to participate in that. And so I guess it's interesting to see how integral, I guess, being able to communicate globally has become. And it's also something we can work on to improve even, so that I guess everybody can hear about the happenings of the world. Obviously, kind of like what Taryn said, though, it can be overwhelming to hear about everything good and bad going on across the world. But I guess at the same time, that interconnectedness, that being able to sympathize with others who we may not even know, but I guess get a little glimpse into their life, I think is pretty important as we go forward as not even just representatives of our own country, but whatever happens globally as we represent ourselves to other countries and things going on there.
Yeah, and I think that is what made it easy for us to do this group, because us having the common connection of like knowing current events and knowing even the events like in other people's like localities, it just helped us to be able to like form better connections with each other, that and like social media, and it really helped to make this a really good experience for us.
How connected we are just as a generation, it enables us to do more. And I think it enables us to A, know what's going on better, B, understand like the weight of certain situations and like scenarios happening around the globe, B, understand our country, understanding our country's politics better, but also D, trying to understand other points of views better. And I think once like a generation can come to a point where we can understand each other better, we're going to be in a better spot. I think where we are as a country, it's like we don't understand each other and we don't want to come to an understanding because we are so wrapped in our own beliefs that it's like we tend to sit back with our own beliefs, with our own biases, with our own prejudices, and we don't listen to other people, we just let them speak and we interject our ideas. But I think just having a generation that's so interconnected, that is actually learning how to A, critical think, but also learn and understand other people it's really, really cool. And it's really inspiring to me. So I think just having this type of group, we all have different like political beliefs, obviously. But at the end of the day, we're all friends because it's like, we've understood that political beliefs don't define us as people, but we also understand each other politically. And we also understand like that beliefs won't always be the same depending on who you ask. You have like the two most Democrat or the two most Republican or the two most independent people, they're still going to have different beliefs on certain issues. So it's like just being able to understand that and not form prejudices or biases based on ideals has been what has made this group super special to me.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Carson just said. I feel like using our interconnectedness to be able to talk to people who might have different opinions than us, who might have different beliefs and experiences, to be able to reach some sort of common ground or at least understand the perspectives of others, not only sort of helps you expand your own worldview, but also helps sort of reach like a common ground of humanity and brings more like kindness into the world, which is important.
I think when Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I think we are starting to see that ideal be placed into our society now. And I think we are starting to see like these ideals that basically founded our country. We're starting to see them become more prevalent today. I think what this group has shown me personally is that we're all equal to each other in terms of our own thoughts and processes. I think one thing that made this group so special was that like we were able to put our ideals together. We all had different ideas about like what different texts meant, what different authors meant, what different people meant. We all placed those ideas together and we got one argument. And I think all of our ideals being equally as important kind of gave us one formal argument.
I would say that we're now in a state where we're stepping forward and kind of understanding each other. It's like what Carson was saying about Thomas Jefferson, we're all equal. We're taking that step forward to all like have the same perspective and understand each other to like move forward to like a new beginning for like everyone.
For me, it's been really comforting knowing that you all are as interested in politics and history and America's future as much as I am. So that's been very comforting to me. And then getting to meet you all was just so fun. So.
And it was an absolute pleasure for me, as was this conversation for Constitution Day. I want to thank you all not only for joining me for this short segment, but also for just persisting in the face of a lot of adversity, in the face of a lot of people saying, it doesn't matter, the future doesn't matter. You all are saying, no, we can make change. We can have a more constitutional society. We can have a more just society. And I'm so grateful that I have had the opportunity to meet you, that you have had the conviction that you come with to this work. And I'm so excited to keep in touch and see where you all go in the future. So thank you for joining me tonight. And I look forward to speaking with you and following you all in your leadership journeys. Have a great day.
Well, we've made it to our final segment of the day, which I can't believe it's gone really fast, as celebrating Constitution Day always does. If you didn't get Chris's trivia questions or you weren't able to answer in time, don't worry. We have all kinds of other opportunities to participate in contests and things throughout the year. So make sure you subscribe, sign up for our email newsletters. Also subscribe to our YouTube page. We have new resources and things coming out all the time. So stay in touch with us on Facebook and Twitter. And we can keep this conversation going. We don't just have to talk about the Constitution only on Constitution Day. We can talk about it all year round, which I'm sure gets everybody really excited. But it's important, and it's interesting to take this day to take a step back, look at the community around us, and better understand our role in it and how the Constitution is at work. And one word that's come up a couple times today, Rachel, as we've been talking about how it is we persuade other individuals, is this idea of rhetoric. And I know rhetoric is something that you've thought about and talked about a little bit in your past life. So why don't you tell us what rhetoric is?
And I love this question because so much of what we have to do in a democracy is work together. We have to dialogue together. We have to use our powers of persuasion to convince others that what we want is what they want, and we have to be open to that convincing ourselves. And so this quote really struck me from today. It's that if you were to persuade a man, you must first convince him you're a friend. And so, of course, this is the case, right? So being adversarial doesn't support the goal of changing someone's mind. Sometimes being adversarial has other goals, right? But if you want to get someone to agree with you, helping them understand that you're acting in a way that supports them and has their best interest at heart is the first step. So thankfully, we aren't the first people to have to learn how to govern together. The ancient Greeks thought a lot about this, and as part of that thinking, they also thought about this idea of rhetoric, which is how to get people to agree with you. What are the components of an argument? So the first, there are many goals, like I said, but if you really want to get someone to agree with you, there are actually 3 components to any argument. And you can think of it kind of like a little triangle. That triangle is ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is credibility, coming and saying who you are and why they should listen to you about this thing. Pathos is creating an emotional appeal, connecting them to the issue that you have and making their lives a part of that issue. And lastly is the logic of the argument, making sure that why you're telling them this is really clear and that you have support for what you're asking them to do.
Awesome. So you're saying with this simple formula, I can convince you of anything. Say that red Skittles are the absolute best flavor and there's no question?
Well, I mean, obviously it's the yellow Skittles, so we would have to battle it out in sophistry.
Oh, well, all kidding aside, we've had some incredible guests today who have talked to us about both this idea of persuasion, but also how it is that the Constitution works and how it is that we observe that work and talk with our public officials and contribute to that ongoing conversation.
And we've heard from Laura Brown and Major Garrett, and what it was like for them to observe and study the actions and roles of the different branches of government and the people who occupy them.
Yeah, we also heard from Dan Mahoney and John Schaff about the nature of statesmanship and political leadership and how exactly it is that elected officials work towards the public good consistent with the principles that are bound up in our Constitution.
And then we had our amazing episode of Scholar Talk with Dan Mahoney and John Schaff about the nature of statesmanship and political leadership and how exactly officials do work towards that public good and that's consistent with the principles of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. That's a hard thing to do, and I'm grateful that they were here to discuss that with us.
Yeah, we also heard from Ben Sasse from Nebraska, who spoke about what the day-to-day life of a senator is like, and what it means to be a public servant and to do public service, and how he makes decisions about what to vote for and what to vote against.
We also had the chance to visit the Lincoln Memorial and hear from Mary Patterson and Park Ranger Jennifer Epstein, who we're very grateful for, to tell us all about that public memorial, what it symbolizes and how it's reflected in the life of one of our most famous political leaders. And don't forget, Chris Jansen, our very own Chris Jansen. We're so grateful to him. He was with us all day with those awesome trivia questions.
That's right. And if you missed any of these segments, they'll all be up on our YouTube page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you want and drop them in your classroom if that's what you need to do, or just go back, refresh, kind of think about some of these ideas because they're really big and complex ideas. And so with that, Rachel, what is it that struck you after today, after going through all this programming?
Well, I did want to be remiss in thanking our incredible student fellows. I think ending with them and their vision for the future and their hope for the future was really what this is all about. Like I said, teaching is an act of optimism. BRI's new mission is the Bill of Rights Institute teaches civics. And that has to be an optimistic act. We have to believe that what we're doing will make a better, more prosperous, more just, more equal America in the future. And so what I love about Constitution Day is the opportunity for us to sit and reflect with these ideas of what does it mean for the Constitution to be at work and what does it mean for the Constitution to work? We've looked at scholars, we looked at elected officials, we looked at students thinking about the future, we had all of our teachers engaging with us online, and I think we really, I feel good about what we did today.
Yeah, I think optimism is a great word because the reality is it's best to go out into civic life thinking that everybody is working towards the best thing that's in front of them, right? Giving charity and being compassionate about others within our community puts us all on a footing where we do want to work towards becoming the friend of everyone so that we can convince them of the direction that we want to go. We're inevitably going to disagree about different policy positions or about different ways of going about accomplishing things. But if you start with the assumption that everybody is just trying to do good for their community, it puts us in a footing where we can begin to have those conversations, where we can discuss with each other as equals and work to become a nation that is realizing these fundamental founding principles that are so important to us and that work to preserve our liberty and equality. And to me, that work is hard because even like Major and Laura talked about, this idea of mandates. The president comes in, he has things he wants to accomplish, but he's got to work with others to get that done. That's that idea of statesmanship that John Schaff and Dan Mahoney were talking about. And we saw Ben Sasse talking about how he works to do that every day. That's hard work. It's hard, and it leads to a lot of disagreement and a lot of frustration. And we all know that that frustration bubbles to the surface a lot, and we hear it. But it's important on days like today to take a step back and remember how amazing it is that this process is even possible, and that we have this structural constitution, as Stan referred to earlier, that allows for this disagreement and these conversations to take place in a way that's productive. And so on Constitution Day, that's really the work that the Constitution does, is it allows us to have those productive conversations that moves us forward as a community and as a nation.
And it doesn't stop today, right? So the Bill of Rights, we're a 365-day-a-year organization. We are here with teachers around the country. We do programming. We have our resources on our incredibly robust website. And we have ways for you to be involved with us. We have incredible groups of supporters. So if you like what you're seeing today and you're interested in supporting us, we would love to have you do that. But really, the My Impact Challenge is probably the newest and best way that you can support this vision of a civil society that is robustly connected to the Constitution. My Impact Challenge, if you're a young person and you want to do work in your community, you can apply. We have a curriculum that will walk you through how to do that with lessons on thinking through how to solve issues in your community through the lenses of government, charity, and entrepreneurship. And then we have our contest and all of our webinars that are coming up. If you're a teacher and you want your students to do this, or a Boy Scout leader, or a club leader, or a homeschooling parent, and you want one of the young people you know to be involved, we would love to hear from you. The My Impact Challenge, the professional development we do, the incredible resources that your team builds and distributes, Kirk, are really the way that we are constantly engaging with the Constitution as a continual work.
Yeah, so please do stay in touch on Facebook, on Twitter. Go to our website, check out our resources, sign up for our email newsletters. There's always new stuff that's coming out and new things that we can think about and work through together.
So thank you again for joining us, to Laura Brown, Major Garrett, Senator Sasse, Dan Mahoney, John Schaaf, Jennifer Epstein, Tony Williams, Mary Patterson, our team here in the studio. We have Stan and Andrew and Kelly and Haley and all of the staff at the Bill of Rights Institute. Everyone made this possible. It was a wonderful day, so thank you so much.
And thank you to all of you who are viewing this, and to all of those who have come in this nation before us who have worked to make this experiment possible. And to paraphrase Alexander Hamilton in the first Federalist paper, it's our choice whether or not to keep this experiment going and whether or not self-government is possible. And so I hope that we all after today can go out and keep making that choice, keep promoting these good habits of self-governance that will keep us living in this free society. So thank you so much for joining, and until next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.